And basically, I really love stories. I really love literature in general and classic literature in particular. So I figured that while we're all stuck at home for a little bit longer, we might as well come together and enjoy some of these stories. Um, Tonight we are going to be continuing our Sherlock Holmes series, I guess. We've been making Sherlock Holmes kind of a Mondays thing for a while now, so we'll probably continue that until we've finished all of the stories, because why not, I guess. Tonight we'll be reading some of the Adventures short story collection. Um, while I do really love these stories, I grew up with them, and I worked in the Sherlock Holmes Museum, and it's really shaped, I think, a lot of my personality growing up. I am very aware of its flaws, and I want to just put a content warning in here for the kinds of language and ideas that you would suspect a white guy from England writing in the 1880s and 1890s. Um, in particular, there's mention of the Ku Klux Klan in the first story. Um, and I think in other stories, there's, kind of derogatory references to various races and ethnic groups, kind of sexist language. In general, I try to, I guess, modify phrases where I can and leave out phrases where they're not relevant, but there are bits that I'm going to miss just by nature of the fact that I'm just reading aloud from a text, and it's not super easy to adapt those things on the fly. So if any of those things are likely to be triggering to you, or they're likely to upset you in any way, you might want to sit this stream out and join us again when we're reading something else. I do hold polls on Instagram during the week for what to read on Fridays, so if you have any suggestions, do let me know. Um, but yeah, without further ado, grab yourself tea or coffee or a beverage of your choice. I've got my classic vintage teacup with some lemon and manuka honey tea. And if you kind of just get yourself cozy, settle in, and we'll begin. So, our first story tonight is called The Five Orange Pips. When I glance over my notes and records of the Sherlock Holmes cases between the years of 82 and 90, I am faced by so many which present strange and interesting features that it is no easy matter to know which to choose and which to leave. Some, however, have already gained publicity through the papers, and others have not offered a field for those particular qualities which my friend possessed in such high a degree, and which it is the object of these papers to illustrate. Some, too, have baffled his analytical skill, and would be, as narratives, beginnings without an ending, while others have been but partially cleared up, and have their explanations founded rather upon conjecture and surmise than on that absolute logical proof which was so dear to him. There is, however, one of these last which was so remarkable in its details, and so startling in its results, that I am tempted to give some account of it in spite of the fact that there are points in connection with it which have never been, and probably never will be, entirely cleared up. The year 87 furnished us with a long series of cases of greater or less interest, of which I retain the records. Among my headings under this one 12 months, I find an account of the adventure of the Paradol Chamber, of the Amateur Mendicant Society, who held a luxurious club in the lower vault of a furniture warehouse, of the facts connected with the loss of the British bark Sophie Anderson, of the singular adventures of the Grice Pattersons in the island of Ufa, and finally of the Camberwell poisoning case. In the latter, as may be remembered, Sherlock Holmes was able, by winding up the dead man's watch, to prove that it had been wound up 2 hours before, and that therefore the deceased had gone to bed within that time, a deduction which was of the greatest importance in clearing up the case. All these I may sketch out at some future date, but none of them present such singular features as the strange train of circumstances which I have now taken up my pen to describe. It was in the latter days of September, when the equinoctial gales had set in with exceptional violence. All day the wind had screamed and the rain had beaten against the windows, so that even here, in the heart of great, handmade London, we were forced to raise our minds for the instant from the routine of life, and to recognize the presence of those great elemental forces which shriek at mankind through the bars of his civilization, like untamed beasts in a cage. As evening drew in, the storm grew higher and louder, and the wind cried and sobbed like a child in the chimney. Sherlock Holmes sat moodily at one side of the fireplace, cross-indexing his records of crime, while I, at the other, was deep in one of Clark Russell's fine sea stories, until the howl of the gale from without seemed to blend with the text, and the splash of the rain to lengthen out into this long swash of the sea waves. My wife was on a visit to her aunt's, and for a few days I was a dweller once more in my old quarters at Baker Street. Why, said I, glancing up at my companion, that was surely the bell. Who could come tonight? Some friend of yours, perhaps? Except yourself, I have none, he answered. I do not encourage visitors. A client, then? If so, it is a serious case. Nothing less would bring a man out on such a day and such an hour. But I take it that it is more likely to be some crony of the landlady's. Sherlock Holmes was wrong in his conjecture, however, for there came a step in the passage and a tapping at the door. He stretched out his long arm to turn the lamp away from himself and towards the vacant chair upon which the newcomer must sit. Come in, said he. The man who entered was young, some 22 at the outside, well-groomed and trimly clad, with something of a refinement and delicacy in his bearing. The steaming umbrella which he held in his hand, and his long shining waterproof, told of the fierce weather through which he had come. He looked about him anxiously in the glare of the lamp. I could see that his face was pale, and his eyes heavy, like those of a man who is weighed down with some great anxiety. I owe you an apology, he said, raising his golden pince-nez to his eyes. I trust that I am not intruding. I fear that I have brought some traces of the storm and rain into your snug chamber. Give me your coat and umbrella, said Holmes. They may rest here on the hook, and will be dry presently. You have come up from the southwest, I see. Yes, from Horsham. That clay and chalk mixture which I see upon your toe-caps is quite distinctive. I have come for advice. Well, that is easily got. And help. That is not always so easy. I have heard of you, Mr. Holmes. I heard from Major Prendergast how you saved him at the Tankerville Club scandal. Ah, of course. He was wrongfully accused of cheating at cards. He said that you could solve anything. I fear he said too much. That you are never beaten? Well, I have been beaten 4 times. 3 times by men, and once by a woman. But what is that compared to with the number of your cases? It is true that I have been generally successful. Well, then you may be so with me. I beg that you will draw up your chair to the fire, and favour me with some details as to your case. Well, sir, it is no ordinary one. None of those which come to me are. I am the last court of appeal. And yet I question, sir, whether in all your experience you have ever listened to a more mysterious and inexplicable chain of events than those which have happened in my own family. You fill me with interest, said Holmes. Pray give us the essential facts from the commencement, and I can afterwards question you as to the details which seem to me to be most important. The young man pulled his chair up and pushed his wet feet out towards the blaze. My name, he said, is John Openshaw, but my own affairs have, as far as I can understand, little to do with this awful business. It is a hereditary matter. So in order to give you an idea of the facts, I must go back to the commencement of the affair. You must know that my grandfather had 2 sons, my uncle Elias and my father Joseph. My father had a small factory at Coventry, which he enlarged at the time of the invention of bicycling. He was a patentee of the Openshaw unbreakable tyre, and his business met with such success that he was able to sell it and to retire upon a handsome competence. My uncle Elias emigrated to America when he was a young man, and became a planter in Florida, where he was reported to have done very well. At the time of the war he fought in Jackson's army, and afterwards under Hood, where he rose to be a colonel. When Lee laid down his arms, my uncle returned to his plantation, where he remained for 3 or 4 years. About 1869 or 1870, he came back to Europe and took a small estate in Sussex near Horsham. He had made a very considerable fortune in the States, and his reason for leaving them was his aversion to the Negroes, and his dislike in expanding. He was a singular man, and quick-tempered, very foul-mouthed when he was angry, and of a most retiring disposition. During all the years that he lived at Horsham, I doubt if he ever set foot in town. He had a garden and 2 or 3 fields round his house, and there he would take his exercise, though very often, for weeks on end, he would never leave his room. He drank a great deal of brandy, and smoked very heavily, and he would see no society and did not want any friends, not even his own brother. He didn't mind me. In fact, he took a fancy to me, for at the time when he saw me first, I was a youngster of 12 or so. This would be in the year 1878, and after he had been 8 or 9 years in England. He begged my father to let me live with him, and he was very kind to me in his way. When he was sober, he used to be fond of playing backgammon and draughts with me, and he would make me his representative both with the servants and with tradespeople, so that by the time I was 16 I was quite master of the house. I kept all the keys and could go where I liked and do what I liked, so long as I did not disturb him in his privacy. There was one singular exception, however, but he had a single room, a lumber room up among the attics, which was invariably locked, and which he would never permit either me or anyone else to enter. With a boy's curiosity, I've peeped through the keyhole, but I was never able to see much more than a collection of old trunks and bundles, as would be expected in such a room. One day, it was in March 1883, a letter with a foreign stamp lay upon the table in front of the Colonel's plate. It was not a common thing for him to receive letters, for his bills were all paid in ready money, and he had no friends of any sort. "From India," said he, as he took it up. "Pondicherry postmark. Who can this be?" Opening it hurriedly, out there jumped 5 little dried orange pips, which pattered down upon his plate. I began to laugh at this, but the laugh was struck from my lips at the sight of his face. His lip had fallen, his eyes were protruding, his skin the colour of putty, and he glared at the envelope which he still held in his trembling hand. "KKK," he shrieked, and then, my God, my sins have overtaken me." "What is it, uncle?" I cried. "Death," said he, and rising from the table he retired to his room, leaving me palpitating with horror. I took up the envelope and saw scrawled in red ink upon the inner flap, just above the gum, the letter K 3 times repeated. There was nothing else save the 5 dried pips. What could be the reason of this overpowering terror? I left the breakfast table, and I ascended the stair. I met him coming down with an old rusty key, which must have belonged to the attic, in one hand, and a small brass box like a cash box in the other. "They may do what they like, but I'll checkmate them still," said he with an oath. "Tell Mary that I shall want a fire in my room to-day, and send down to Fordham, the Horsham lawyer." I did as he ordered, and when the lawyer arrived I was asked to step up to the room. Fire was burning brightly, and in the grate there was a mass of black fluffy ashes, as of burned paper, while the brass box stood open and empty beside it. As I glanced at the box I noticed, with a start, that upon the lid was printed the treble K which I had read in the morning upon my envelope. "I wish you, John," said my uncle, "to witness my will. I leave my estate, with all its advantages and all its disadvantages, to my brother your father, whence it will no doubt descend to you. If you can enjoy it in peace, well and good. If you find you cannot, take my advice, my boy, and leave it to your deadliest enemy. I am sorry to give you such a two-edged thing, but I can't say what turn things are going to take. Kindly sign the paper where Mr. Fordham shows you." Well, I signed the paper as directed, and the lawyer took it away with him. The singular incident made, as you may think, the deepest impression upon me, and I pondered over it, and turned it every way in my mind, without being able to make anything of it. Yet I could not shake the vague feeling of dread which it left behind, though the sensation grew less keen as the weeks passed, and nothing happened to disturb the usual routine of our lives. I could see a change in my uncle, however. He drank more than ever, and he was less inclined for any sort of society. Most of his time he would spend in his room, with the door either locked upon the inside, but sometimes he would emerge in a sort of drunken frenzy, and would burst out of the house and tear about the garden with a revolver in his hand, screaming out that he was afraid of no man, and that he would not be cooped up like a sheep in a pen by man or devil. When these hot fits were over, however, he would rush tumultuously in at the door, and lock and bar it behind him like a man who can brazen it out no longer against the terror which lies at the root of his soul. At such times I have seen his face, even on a cold day, glisten with moisture, as though it were new raised from a basin. Well, to come to an end of the matter, Mr. Holmes, and not to abuse your patience, there came a night when he made one of those drunken sallies from which he never came back. We found him, when we went to search for him, face downward in a little green-scummed pool, which lay at the foot of the garden. There was no sign of any violence, and the water was but 2 foot deep, so that the jury, having regard to his known eccentricity, brought in a verdict of suicide. But I, who knew how he winced at the very thought of death, had much ado to persuade myself that he had gone out of his way to meet it. The matter passed, however, and my father entered into possession of the estate, and some £14,000 which lay to his credit at the bank. One moment, Holmes interposed. Your statement is, I foresee, one of the most remarkable to which I have ever listened. Let me have the date of the Let me have the date of the reception by your uncle of the letter, and the date of his supposed suicide. Well, the letter arrived on March 10th, 1883, and his death was 7 weeks later, upon the night of the 2nd of May. Well, thank you. Pray proceed. When my father took over the Horsham property, he, at my request, made a careful examination of the attic, which had always been locked up. We found the brass box there, although its contents had been destroyed, and on the inside of the cover was a paper label with the initials of KKK repeated upon it, and letters, memoranda, receipts, and a register written beneath. These, we presume, indicated the nature of the papers which had been destroyed by Colonel Openshaw, but for the rest, there was nothing of much importance in the attic, save a great many scattered papers and notebooks bearing upon my uncle's life in America. Some of them were of the wartime and showed that he had done his duty well, and had borne the repute of a brave soldier. Others were of a date during the reconstruction of the southern states, and were mostly concerned with politics, for he had evidently taken a strong part in opposing politicians who had been sent down from the north. Well, it was in the beginning of '84 when my father came to live at Horsham, and all went well as possible. '85. On the 4th day after the New Year, I heard my father give a sharp cry of surprise as we sat together at the breakfast table. There he was, sitting with a newly opened envelope in one hand, and 5 dried orange pips in the outstretched palm of the other one. He had always laughed at what he called my cock and bull story about the colonel, but he looked very scared and puzzled now that the same thing had happened to him. Why, what on earth does it mean, John? He stammered. My heart has turned to lead. It is KKK, I said. He looked inside the envelope. So it is, he cried. Here are the very letters, but what is this written above them? Put the papers on the sundial, I read, peeping over his shoulder. What papers? What sundial? He asked. The sundial in the garden, there is no other, said I. But the papers must be those that are destroyed. Phew, he said, gripping hard at his courage. We are in a civilized land here, and we can't have tomfoolery of this kind. Where does the thing come from? From Dundee, I answered, glancing at the postmark. Some preposterous practical joke, said he. What have I to do with sundials and papers? I shall take no notice of such nonsense. Well, I should certainly speak to the police, I said. And be laughed at for my pains. Nothing of the sort. Well, then let me do so. No, I forbid you. I won't have a fuss made about such nonsense. Well, it was in vain to argue with him, for he was a very obstinate man, and I went about, however, with a heart that was full of forebodings. On the 3rd day after the coming of the letter, my father went from home to visit an old friend of his, Major Freebody, who was in command of one of the forts upon Portsdown Hill. I was glad that he could go, for it seemed to me that he was further from the danger than when he was away from home. In that, however, I was in error. Upon the 2nd day of his absence, I received a telegram from the Major, imploring me to come at once. My father had fallen over one of the deep chalk pits which abound in the neighbourhood, and was lying senseless with a shattered skull. I hurried to him, but he passed away without having ever recovered his consciousness. He had, as it appears, been returning from Fareham in the twilight, and as the country was unknown to him, and the chalk pit unfenced, the jury had no hesitation in bringing in a verdict of death from accidental causes. Carefully as I examined every fact connected with his death, I was unable to find anything which would suggest the idea of murder. There were no signs of violence, no footmarks, no robbery, no record of strangers having been seen upon the roads, and yet I need not tell you that my mind was far from at ease, and that I was well nigh certain that some foul plot had been woven around him. In this sinister way I came into my inheritance. You will ask me why I did not dispose of it. I answer, because I was well convinced that our troubles were in some way dependent upon an incident in my uncle's life, and that the danger would be as pressing on one house as in another. It was in January '85 that my poor father met his end, and 2 years and 8 months have elapsed since then. During that time I have lived happily at Horsham, and had begun to hope that this curse had passed away from the family, and that it had ended with the last generation. I had begun to take comfort too soon, however. Yesterday morning the blow fell in the very shape in which it had come upon my father. The young man took from his waistcoat a crumpled envelope to the table. He shook out upon it 5 little dried orange pips. "This is the envelope," he continued. "The postmark is London, Eastern Division. Within are the very words upon which my father's last message, KKK, and then put the papers on the sundial." "Well, what have you done?" asked Holmes. "Nothing." "Nothing?" To tell the truth, he sank his face into his thin white hands. "I have felt helpless. I felt like one of those poor rabbits when the snake is writhing towards it. I seem to be in the grasp of some resistless, inexorable evil with no foresight and no precautions can guard against." "Tut, tut!" cried Sherlock Holmes. "Nothing but energy can save you. There is no time for despair. I have seen the police. Ah, but they listened to my story with a smile. I'm convinced that the inspector has formed the opinion that the letters are all practical jokes, and that the deaths of my relations were really accidents, as the jury stated, and were not to be connected with the warnings." Holmes shook his clenched hands in the air. "Incredible imbecility!" he cried. "They have, however, allowed me a policeman, who may remain in the house with me." "Has he come with you tonight?" "No, his orders were to stay in the house." Again Holmes raved in the air. "Why did you come to me?" he cried. "And above all, why did you not come at once?" "I didn't know. It was only today that I spoke to Major Prendergast about my troubles, and was advised by him to come to you." "Is it really 2 days since you had the letter? We should have acted before this. You have no further evidence, I suppose, than that which you have placed before us, no suggestive detail which might help us." "There is one thing," said John Openshaw. He rummaged in his coat pocket, and drawing out a piece of discoloured blue-tinted paper, he laid it upon the table. "I have some remembrance," said he, "that on the day when my uncle burned the papers, I observed that the small unburned margins which lay amid the ashes were of this particular colour. I found this single sheet upon the floor of his room, and I am inclined to think that it may be one of the papers which has, perhaps, fluttered out from among the others, and in that way escaped destruction. Beyond the mention of pips, I do not see that it helps us much. I think myself that it is a page from some private diary. The writing is undoubtedly my uncle's." Holmes moved the lamp, and we both bent over the sheet of paper, which showed by its ragged edge that it had indeed been torn from a book. It was headed March 1869, and beneath were the following enigmatical notices: 4th, Hudson came. Same old platform. 7th, set the pips on Macaulay, Paramore, and John Swain of St. Augustine. 9th, Macaulay cleared. 10th, John Swain cleared. 12th, visited Paramore. All well. "Thank you," said Holmes, folding up the paper and returning it to our visitor. "And now you must on no account lose another instant. We cannot spare time, even to discuss what you have told me. You must get home instantly and act." "Well, what shall I do?" "There is but one thing to do. It must be done at once. You must put this piece of paper, which you have shown us, into the brass box which you have described. You must also put in a note to say that all the other papers were burned by your uncle, and that this is the only one which remains. You must assert that in such words as will carry conviction with them. Having done this, you must at once put the box upon the sundial, as directed. Do you understand?" "Entirely." "Do not think of revenge or anything of the sort at present. I think that we may gain that by means of the law, but we have our web to weave, while theirs is already woven. The first consideration is to remove the pressing danger which threatens you. The second is to clear up the mystery and to punish the guilty parties." "I thank you," said the young man, rising and pulling on his overcoat. "You have given me fresh life and hope. I shall certainly do as you advise. Do not lose an instant, and above all, take care of yourself in the meanwhile, for I do not think that there can be a doubt that you are threatened by a very real and imminent danger. How do you go back?" "By train from Waterloo." "It's not yet 9. The streets will be crowded, so I trust that you may be in safety. And yet you cannot guard yourself too closely." "I am armed." "Well, that is well. Tomorrow I shall set to work upon your case." "I shall see you at Horsham, then?" "No. Your secret lies in London. It is there that I shall seek it." "Then I shall call upon you in a day, or in 2 days, with news as to the box and the papers. I shall take your advice in every particular." He shook hands with us and took his leave. Outside, the wind still screamed and the rain splashed and pattered against the windows. This strange, wild story seemed to have come to us from amid the mad elements. blown in upon us like a sheet of seaweed in a gale, and now to have been reabsorbed by them once more. Sherlock Holmes sat for some time in silence, with his head sunk forward and his eyes bent upon the red glow of the fire. Then he lit his pipe, and leaning back in his chair, he watched the blue smoke rings as they chased each other up to the ceiling. "I think, Watson," he remarked at last, "that of all our cases we have had none more fantastic than this. Well, save perhaps the sign of the Four. Well, yes, save perhaps that. And yet this John Openshaw seems to me to be walking amid even greater perils than did the Sholtos." "But have you," I asked, "formed any definite conception as to what these perils are?" "Well, there can be no question as to their nature," he answered. "Then what are they? Who is this KKK, and why does he pursue this unhappy family?" Sherlock Holmes closed his eyes and placed his elbows upon the arms of his chair with his fingertips together. "The ideal reasoner," he remarked, "would, when he had once been shown a single fact in all its bearings, deduce from it not only the chain of events which led up to it, but also all the results which would follow from it. As Cuvier would correctly describe a whole animal by a contemplation of a single bone, so the observer who has thoroughly understood one link in a series of incidents should be able to accurately state all the other ones, both before and after. We have not yet grasped the results, which the reason alone can attain to. Problems may be solved in the study which have baffled all those who have brought the situation by aid of the senses. To carry the art, however, to its highest pitch, it is necessary that the reasoner should be able to utilize all the facts which have come to his knowledge, and that this in itself implies, as you will readily see, the possession of all knowledge, which, even in these days of free education and encyclopedias, is a somewhat rare accomplishment. It is not so impossible, however, that a man should possess all knowledge which is likely to be useful to him in his work, and this I have endeavoured in my case to do. If I remember rightly, you, on one occasion in the early days of our friendship, defined my limits in a very precise fashion." "Yes," I answered, laughing. "It was a singular document. Philosophy, astronomy, and politics were marked at 0, I remember, botany variable, geology profound as regards to the mudstains from any region within a 50-mile radius of town, chemistry, anatomy unsystematic, sensational literature and crime records unique, violin player, boxer, swordsman, lawyer, and self-poisoner by cocaine and tobacco. Those, I think, were the main points of my analysis." Holmes grinned at the last item. "Well," he said, "I say now as I said then, that a man should keep his little brain attic stocked with all the furniture that he is likely to use, and the rest he can put away in the lumber room of his library, where he can get it if he wants it. Now for such a case as the one which has been submitted to us tonight, we need certainly to muster all our resources. Kindly hand me down the letter K of the American Encyclopedia which stands upon the shelf behind you. Thank you. Now let us consider the situation, and see what may be deduced from it. In the first place, we may start with a strong presumption that Colonel Openshaw had some very strong reason for leaving America. Men at his time of life do not change all their habits and exchange willingly the charming climate of Florida for the lonely life of an English provincial town. His extreme love of solitude in England suggests the idea that he was in fear of someone or something. So we may assume that, as a working hypothesis, that it was fear of someone or something which drove him from America. As to what it was that he feared, we can only deduce that by considering the formidable letters which were received by him, and his successors. Do you remark the postmarks of those letters? Yes, the first was from Pondicherry, the second from Dundee, and the third from London. From East London. What do you deduce from that? Well, they're all seaports. The writer was aboard a ship. Excellent. We already have a clue. There can be no doubt that the strong probability, is that the writer was on board of a ship. Now let us consider another point. In the case of Pondicherry, 7 weeks elapsed between the threat and its fulfillment. In Dundee, it was only some 3 or 4 days. Does that suggest anything? A greater distance to travel. But the letter had also a greater distance to come. Then I do not see the point. There is at least a presumption that the vessel in which the man or men are is a sailing ship. It looks as if they always send their singular warning or token before them when starting upon their mission. You see how quickly the deed followed the sign when it came from Dundee, as if they had come from Pondicherry in a steamer, they would have arrived almost as soon as their letter. But as a matter of fact, 7 weeks elapsed. I think that those 7 weeks represented the difference between the mailboat which brought the letter and the sailing vessel which brought the writer. It is possible. More than that, it's probable. And now you see the deadly urgency of this new case, and why I urged young Openshaw to caution. The blow has always fallen at the end of the time which it would take the senders to travel the distance. But this one comes from London, and therefore we cannot count upon delay. Good God, I cried. What can it mean, this relentless persecution? The papers which Openshaw carried are obviously of vital importance to the person or persons in the sailing ship. I think that it is quite clear that there must be more than one of them. A single man could not have carried out 2 deaths in such a way as to deceive a coroner's jury. There must have been several in it, and they must have been men of resource and determination. Their papers they mean to have, be the holder of them who it may. In this way, you see, KKK ceases to be the initials of an individual and becomes the badge of a society. But of what society? Have you never, said Sherlock Holmes, bending forward and sinking his voice, have you never heard of the Ku Klux Klan? I never have. Holmes turned over the leaves of the book upon his knee. Here it is, said he presently. Ku Klux Klan, a name derived from the fanciful resemblance to the sound produced by cocking a rifle. This terrible secret society was formed by some ex-Confederate soldiers in the southern states after the Civil War, and it rapidly formed local branches in different parts of the country, notably in Tennessee, Louisiana, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. Its power was used for political purposes, specifically for the terrorizing of the black voters, and murdering and driving from the country of those who were opposed to its views. Its outrages were usually preceded by a warning sent to the marked man in some fantastic but generally recognized shape. A sprig of oak leaves in some parts, melon seeds or orange pips in others. On receiving this, the victim might either openly abjure his former ways, or might fly from the country. If he braved the matter out, death would unfailingly come upon him, and usually in some strange and unforeseen manner. So perfect was the organization of the society, and so systematic in its methods, that there is hardly a case upon record where any man succeeded in braving it with impunity, or in which any of its outrages were traced home to their perpetrators. For some years, the organization flourished in spite of the efforts of the United States government and of the better classes of the community in the South. And eventually, in the year 1869, the movement rather suddenly collapsed, although there have been sporadic outbreaks of the same sort since that date. You will observe, said Holmes, laying down the volume, that the sudden breaking up of the society was coincident with the disappearance of Openshaw from America with their papers. It may well have been cause and effect. It is no wonder that he and his family have some of the more implacable spirits upon their track. You can understand that this register and diary may implicate some of the first men in the South, and that there may be many who will not sleep easy at night until it is recovered. Then the page we have seen is such as we might expect. It ran to A, B, and C, that is, sent the society's warning to them. Then there are successive entries that A and B cleared or left the country, and finally that C was visited with, I fear, a sinister result for C. Well, I think, Doctor, that we may let some light into this dark place, and I believe that the only chance young Openshaw has in the meantime is to do what I have told him. There is nothing more to be said or be done tonight, so hand me over my violin, and let us try to forget for half an hour the miserable weather and the more still miserable ways of our fellow men. Oh, hey guys. Sorry, I have not been paying attention to the chat since I started reading. Alright. Well, I am glad to see you guys are here and that you've been enjoying it. I will continue with the story now I'm not distracting myself. Alright. It had cleared in the morning, and the sun was shining with a subdued brightness through the dim veil which hangs over the great city. Sherlock Holmes was already at breakfast when I came down. You will excuse me for not waiting for you, said he. I have, I foresee, Very busy day before me in looking into this case of young Openshaw's. What steps will you take? I asked. It will very much depend upon the results of my first inquiries. I may have to go down to Horsham after all. You will not go there first? No, I shall commence with the city. Just ring the bell, and the maid will bring up your coffee. As I waited, I lifted the unopened newspaper from the table and glanced my eye over it. It rested upon a heading which was sent a chill to my heart. Holmes, I cried. You're too late. Ah, said he, laying down his cup. I feared as much. How was it done? He spoke calmly, but I could see that he was deeply moved. My eye caught the name of Openshaw, and the heading, Tragedy near Waterloo Bridge. Here is the account. Between 9 and 10 last night, Police Constable Cook, of the H Division, on duty near Waterloo Bridge, heard a cry for help and a splash in the water. The night, however, was extremely dark and stormy, so that, in spite of the help of several passers-by, it was quite impossible to effect a rescue. The alarm, however, was given, and, by the aid of the water police, the body was eventually recovered. It proved to be that of a young gentleman, whose name, as it appears from an envelope which was found in his pocket, was John Openshaw, and whose residence is near Horsham. It is conjectured that he may have been hurrying down to catch the last train from Waterloo Station, and that in his haste and the extreme darkness he missed his path and walked over to the edge of one of the small landing places for river steamboats. The body exhibited no traces of violence, and there can be no doubt that the deceased had been a victim of an unfortunate accident, which should have the effect of calling the attention of the authorities to the condition of the riverside landing stages. We sat in silence for some minutes, Holmes more depressed and shaken than I had ever seen him. That hurts my pride, Watson, he said at last. It is a petty feeling, no doubt, but it hurts my pride. It becomes a personal matter with me now, and if God sends me health, I shall set my hand upon this gang. That he should come to me for help, and that I should send him away to his death. He sprang from his chair, and paced about the room in uncontrollable agitation, with a flush upon his sallow cheeks, and a nervous clasping and unclasping of his long, thin hands. They must be cunning devils, he exclaimed at last. How could they have decoyed him down there? The embankment is not on the direct line to the station. The bridge, no doubt, was too crowded, even on such a night, for their purpose. Well, Watson, we shall see who will win in the long run. I'm going out now. To the police? No, I shall be my own police. When I've spun the web, they may take the flies, but not before. All day I was engaged in my professional work, and it was late in the evening before I returned to Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes had not come back yet. It was nearly 10 o'clock before he entered, looking pale and worn. He walked up to the sideboard, and tearing a piece from the loaf, he devoured it voraciously, washing it down with a long draught of water. You're hungry, I remarked. Starving. It had escaped my memory. I've had nothing since breakfast. Nothing? Not a bite. I had no time to think of it. And how did you succeed? Well. You have a clue? I have them in the hollow of my hand. Young Openshaw shall not long remain unavenged. Why, Watson, let us put their own devilish trademark upon them. It's well thought of. What do you mean? He took an orange from the cupboard, and tearing it to pieces, he squeezed out the pips upon the table. Of these, he took 5, and thrust them in an envelope. On the inside of the flap, he wrote S.H. for J.O. Then he sealed it and addressed it to Captain James Calhoun, Bark, Lone Star, Savannah, Georgia. That will await him when he enters port, said he, chuckling. It may give him a sleepless night. He will find it as sure a persecutor of his fate as Openshaw did before him. And who is this Captain Calhoun? The leader of the gang. I shall have the others, but he first. How did you trace it, then? He took a large sheet of paper from his pocket, all covered with dates and names. I have spent the whole day in the registers and files of the old papers, following the future career of every vessel which touched at Pondicherry in January and February in '83. There were 36 ships of fair tonnage which were reported there during those months. Of these, one, the Lone Star, instantly attracted my attention, since, although it was reported as having cleared from London, the name is that which is given to one of the states of the Union. Texas, I think. I was not, and am not sure which, but I knew that the ship must have an American origin. Well, what then? I searched the Dundee records, and when I found that the bark Lone Star was there on January 85, my suspicion became a certainty. I then inquired as to the vessels which lay at present in the port of London. Yes? The Lone Star had arrived here last week. I went down to the Albert Dock and found that she had been taken down the river by the early tide this morning, homeward bound to Savannah. I wired to Gravesend and learned that she had passed some time ago, and as the wind is easterly, I have no doubt that she has now passed the Goodwins and not very far from the Isle of Wight. Well, what will you do then? Oh, I have my hand upon him. He and the two mates are, as I learn, the only native-born Americans in the ship. The others are Finns and Germans. I know also that they were all three away from the ship last night. I had it from the stevedore who has been loading their cargo. By the time that the sailing ship reaches Savannah, the mailboat will have carried this letter, and the cable will have informed the police of Savannah that these three gentlemen are badly wanted here upon charge of murder. There is a flaw, however, in the best laid of human plans, and the murderers of John Openshaw were never to receive the orange pips which would show them that another, as cunning and as resolute as themselves, was upon their track. Very long and very severe were the equinoctial gales that year. We waited long for news of the Lone Star of Savannah, but none ever reached us. We did at last hear that, somewhere far out in the Atlantic, a shattered sternpost of a boat was seen swinging in the trough of a wave, with the letters LS carved upon it, and that is all we shall ever know of the fate of the Lone Star. That's such a, I don't remember when I read this story. I think I read it when I was like 6 or 7, and clearly before I had heard of the KKK, because I thought that was just like, what a plot twist. Now, of course, it's very much obvious from the start what's happening, but obviously at the time, in like 1887, I think this one was written, it wasn't like a well-known organization or like a prominent thing that certainly people in England, probably wouldn't have known about it, which is just, I don't know, kind of an interesting relic of history. But yeah, so the next story is called The Man with the Twisted Lip. Actually, this is one of my favorite ones because it's just another bizarre one, like the Red-Headed League, kind of. All right. Isa Whitney, brother of the late Elias Whitney, D.D., principal of the Theological College of St. George's, was much addicted to opium. The habit grew upon him, as I understand, from some foolish freak when he was at college. For having read De Quincey's description of his dreams and sensations, he had drenched his tobacco with laudanum in an attempt to produce the same effects. He found, as so many more have done, that the practice is easier to attain than to get rid of, and for many years he continued to be a slave to the drug, an object of mingled horror and pity to his friends and relatives. I can see him now, with a yellow, pasty face, drooping lids and pinpoint pupils, all huddled in a chair, the wreck and ruin of a noble man. One night, it was in June 89, there came a ring to my bell, about the hour when a man gives his first yawn and glances at the clock. I sat up in my chair, and my wife laid her needlework down in her lap and made a little face of disappointment. "Ah, a patient," she said. "You'll have to go out." I groaned, for I was newly come back from a weary day. The door opened, a few hurried words, and then quick steps upon the linoleum. Our own door flew open, and a lady, clad in some dark-coloured stuff with a black veil, entered the room. "You will excuse my calling so late," she began, and then, suddenly losing her self-control, she ran forward, threw her arms about the neck of my wife, and sobbed upon her shoulder. "Oh, I'm in such trouble," she cried. "I do so want a little help." "Why," said my wife, pulling up her veil, "it is Kate Whitney. How you startled me, Kate. I had not an idea who you were when you came in. I don't know what to do, so I came straight to you." That was always the way. Folk who were in grief came to my wife like birds to a lighthouse. "It was very sweet of you to come. Now you must have some wine and water, and sit here comfortably and tell us all about it. Or should you rather that I sent James off to bed?" "Oh, no, no. I want the doctor's advice and help too. It's about Isa. He's not been home for 2 days, and I'm so frightened about him." It was not the first time that she had spoken to us of her husband's trouble, to me as a doctor, and to my wife as an old friend and school companion. We soothed and comforted her by such words as we could find, was? Was it possible that we could bring him back to her? It seems that it was. She had the surest information that of late he had, when the fit was on him, made use of an opium den in the farthest east of the city. Hitherto his orgies had been confined to one day, and he had come back twitching and shattered in the evening. But now the spell had been upon him for 8 and 40 hours, and he lay there doubtless among the dregs of the docks, breathing in the poison and sleeping off the effects. There he was to be found to be sure of it, at the Bar of Gold in Upper Swandam Lane. But what was she to do? How could she, a young and timid woman, make her way into such a place, and pluck her husband out of it from among the ruffians who surrounded him? There was the case, and of course there was but one way out of it. Might I not escort her to this? And as a second thought, why should she come at all? I was Isa Whitney's medical adviser, and as such, I had influence over him. I could manage it better if I were alone. I promised her on my word that I would send him home in a cab within 2 hours, if he were indeed at the address which she had given me. And so, in 10 minutes, I had left my armchair and cheery sitting room behind me, and was speeding eastward in a hansom on a strange errand. As it seemed to me at the time, though the future could only show how strange it was to be. There was no great difficulty in the first stage of my adventure. Upper Swandam Lane is a vile alley lurking behind the high wharves which line the north side of the river to the east of London Bridge. Between a slop shop and a gin shop, by a steep flight of steps leading down to a black gap like a mouth of the cave, I found the den of which I was in search. Ordering my cab to wait, I pressed down the steps, worn hollow in the centre by the ceaseless tread of drunken feet, and by the light of a flickering oil lamp over the door, I found the latch, and made my way into a long, low room, thick and heavy with the brown opium smoke, and terraced with wooden berths, like the forecastle of an emigrant ship. Through the gloom, one could dimly catch a glimpse of bodies lying in strange, fantastic poses, bowed shoulders, bent knees, heads thrown back, and chins pointing upwards, with here and there a dark, lacklustre eye turned upon the newcomer. Fanning poison waxed or waned in the bowls of the metal pipes. Most lay silent, but some muttered to themselves, and others talked together in a strange, low, monotonous voice, their conversation coming in gushes, and then suddenly trailing off into silence, each mumbling out his own thoughts and paying little heed to the words of his neighbour. At the farther end was a small brazier of burning charcoal, beside which, on a three-legged wooden stool, there sat a tall, thin old man, with his jaw resting upon his two fists and his elbows upon his knees, staring into the fire. As I entered, a sallow Malay attendant had hurried up with a pipe for me and a supply of the drug, beckoning me to an empty berth. "Thank you, I have not come to stay," said I. "There's a friend of mine here, Mr. Isa Whitney, and I wish to speak with him." There was a movement, and an exclamation from my right. Mr. Whitney, pale and haggard and unkempt, staring out at me. "My God, it's Watson," said he. He was in a pitiable state of reaction, with every nerve in a twitter. "I say, Watson, what o'clock is it?" "Nearly 11." "Of what day?" "Of Friday, June 19th." "Good heavens! I thought it was Wednesday." "It is Wednesday. Why do you want to frighten a chap for?" He sank his face into his arms and began to sob in a high treble key. "I tell you that it's Friday, man. Your wife has been waiting these 2 days for you. You should be ashamed of yourself." "So I am, but you've got it mixed, Watson, for I've only been 3 pipes or 4. I forget how many. But I'll go home with you. I wouldn't frighten Kate. Oh, poor little Kate. Give me your hand. Have you a cab?" "Yes, I have one waiting." "Then I shall go in it. But I must owe something. Find what I owe, Watson. I'm all off colour. I can do nothing for myself." I walked down the narrow passage between the double row of sleepers, holding my breath to keep out the vile, stupefying fumes of the drug, and looked about for the manager. As I passed the tall man who sat by the brazier, I felt a sudden pluck at my skirts, and a low voice whispered, "Walk past me, and then look back at me." It fell quite distinctly upon my ear. I glanced down. They could only have come from the old man at my side, and yet he sat now as absorbed as ever, very thin, very wrinkled, bent with age, an opium pipe dangling down from between his knees, as though it had dropped in sheer lassitude from his fingers. I took 2 steps forward and looked back. It took all of my self-control to prevent me from breaking out into a cry of astonishment. He had turned his back so that none could see him but I. His form had filled out, his wrinkles were gone, the dull eyes had regained their fire. Grinning at surprise was none other than Sherlock Holmes. He made a slight motion for me to approach him, and instantly, as he had turned his face half round to the company once more, subsided into doddering, loose-lipped senility. "Holmes," I whispered, "what on earth are you doing in this den?" "As low as you can," he answered. "I have excellent ears. If you would have the great kindness to get rid of that sottish friend of yours, I should be exceedingly glad to have a little talk with you. I have a cab outside. Then pray send him home in it. You may safely trust him, for he appears to be too limp to get into any mischief. I should recommend you also send a note by the cabman throwing your lot with me. If you will wait outside, I shall be with you in 5 minutes." It was difficult to refuse any of Sherlock Holmes's requests, for they were always so exceedingly definite, and put forward with such a quiet air of mastery. I felt, however, that when Whitney was once confined in the cab, my mission was practically accomplished, and for the rest I could not wish anything better than to be associated with my friend in one of those singular adventures which were the normal condition of his existence. In a few moments I had written my note, paid Whitney's bill, led him out to the cab, and seen him driven through the darkness. In a very short time a decrepit figure had emerged from the opium den, and I was walking down the street when Sherlock Holmes. Street with Sherlock Holmes. For 2 streets he shuffled along with a bent back and an uncertain foot. Then, glancing quickly around, he straightened himself out and burst into a hearty fit of laughter. "I suppose, Watson," said he, "that you imagine that I have added opium smoking to cocaine injections and all the other little weaknesses on which you have favoured me with your medical views. I was certainly surprised to find you there, but no more so than I to find you. I came to find a friend, and I to find an enemy." "An enemy?" "Yes, one of my natural enemies. Enemies, yes, I'm one of my natural enemies. Or shall I say my natural prey? Watson, I am in the midst of a very remarkable inquiry, and I have hoped to find a clue in the incoherent ramblings of these sots, as I have done before now. Had I been recognised in that den, my life would not have been worth an hour's purchase, for I have used it before now for my own purposes, and the rascally Lascar who runs it has sworn to have vengeance upon me. There's a trap-door at the back of that building, near the corner of Paul's Wharf, which could tell some strange tales of what has passed through it upon moonless nights." "What, you don't mean bodies?" "Ay, bodies, Watson. We should be rich men if we had £1,000 for every poor devil who's been done to death in that den. It's the vilest murder trap on the whole riverside, and I fear that Neville St. Clair has entered it never to leave no more. The trap should be here." He put his 2 forefingers between his teeth and whistled shrilly, a signal which was answered by a similar whistle from the distance, followed shortly by the rattle of wheels and the clink of horses' hoofs. "Now, Watson," said Holmes, as a tall dog-cart dashed up through the gloom, throwing out 2 golden tunnels of yellow light from its side lanterns. "You'll come with me, won't you?" "If I can be of any use." "Oh, a trusty comrade is always of use, and a chronicler still more so. My room at the Cedars is a double-bedded one." "The Cedars?" "Yes, that is Mr. St. Clair's house. I'm staying there while I conduct the inquiry." "Where is it, then?" "Near Lee, in Kent. We have a 7-mile drive before us." "In the dark." "Of course you are. You'll know all about it presently. Jump up here. All right, John. We shall not need you. Here's half-a-crown, and look out for me tomorrow about 11. Give her her head. So long, then." He flicked the horse with his whip, and we dashed away through the endless succession of sombre and deserted streets, which widened gradually until we were flying across a broad balustraded bridge, with the murky river flowing sluggishly beneath us. Beyond lay another dull wilderness of bricks and mortar, its silence broken only by the heavy, regular footfall of the policeman, or the songs and shouts of some belated party of revellers. A dull wrack was drifting slowly across the sky, and a star or two twinkled dimly here and there. Holmes drove in silence, with his head sunk upon his breast, and the air of a man who is lost in thought. While I sat beside him, curious to learn what this new quest might be which seemed to tax his powers so sorely, and yet afraid to break in upon the current of his thoughts. We had driven several miles, and were beginning to get to the fringe of the belt of the suburban villas, when he shook himself, shrugged his shoulders, and lit up his pipe with the air of a man who has satisfied himself that he's acting for the best. You have a grand gift of silence, Watson, said he. It makes you quite invaluable as a companion. On my word, it is a great thing for me to have someone to talk to, for my own thoughts are not over pleasant. I was wondering what I should say to this dear little girl. You forget that I know nothing about it, and I shall just have time to tell you the facts of the case before we get to Lee. It seems absurdly simple, and yet somehow I can get nothing to go upon. There's plenty of thread, no doubt, but I can't get to the end of it with my hand. Now I'll state the case clearly and concisely to you, Watson, and maybe you can see a spark where all is dark to me. Proceed, then. Some years ago, to be definite, in May 1884, there came to Lee a gentleman, Neville Sinclair by name, who appeared to have plenty of money. He took a large villa, laid out the grounds very nicely. By degrees, he made friends in the neighbourhood, and in 1887 he married the daughter of a local brewer, by whom he now has 2 children. He had no occupation, but was interested in several companies and went into town as a rule in the morning, returning by the 5:14 from Cannon Street every night. Mr. Sinclair is now 37 years of age, is a man of temperate habits, a good husband, a very affectionate father, and a man who is popular with all who know him. I may add that his whole debts are, at the present moment, as far as we've been able to ascertain, amount to £88 10s, and £20 standing to his credit in the Capital and Counties Bank. There is no reason, therefore, to think that money troubles have been weighing upon his mind. Last Monday, Mr. Neville Sinclair went into town rather earlier than usual, remarking before he started that he had 2 important commissions to perform, and that he would bring his little boy home a box of bricks. Now, by the merest chance, his wife received a telegram upon this same Monday, very shortly after his departure, to the effect that a small parcel of considerable value which she had been expecting was waiting for her at the offices of the Aberdeen Shipping Company. Now, if you are well up in your London, you will know that the office of the company is in Fresno Street, which branches out of Upper Swandam Lane, where you found me tonight. After lunch, started for the city, did some shopping, proceeded to the company's office, got her packet, and found herself at exactly 4:35, walking through Swandam Lane on her way back to the station. Have you followed me so far? Yes, it's very clear. If you remember, Monday was an exceedingly hot day. Mrs. Sinclair walked slowly, glancing about in the hope of seeing a cab, and as she did not like the neighbourhood in which she found herself. While she was walking in this way down Swandam Lane, she suddenly heard a cry, and was struck cold to see her husband looking down at her, and, as it seemed to her, beckoning to her from a second-floor window. The window was open, and she distinctly saw his face, which she described. He waved his hands frantically to her, and then vanished from the window so suddenly that it seemed to her that he had been plucked back by some irresistible force from behind. One singular point which struck her quick feminine eye was that although he wore some dark coat such as he had started to in town, he had on neither collar nor necktie. Convinced that something was amiss with him, she rushed down the steps, for the house was none other than the opium den in which you found me tonight, and running through the front room, she attempted to ascend the stairs which led to the first floor. At the foot of the stairs, however, she met this Lascar scoundrel of whom I have spoken, who thrust her back and, aided by a Dane, pushed her out into the street. Filled with the most maddening doubts and fears, she rushed down the lane, and, by rare good fortune, met, in Fresno Street, a number of constables with an inspector, all on their way to the beat. The inspector and 2 men accompanied her back, and in spite of the continued resistance of the proprietor, they made their way to the room in which Mr. Sinclair had last been seen. There was no sign of him there. In fact, in the whole of that floor there was no one to be found save a crippled wretch of hideous aspect, who, it seems, made his home there. Both he and the Lascar stoutly swore that no one else had been in the front room during the afternoon. So determined was their denial that the inspector was staggered. He had almost come to believe that Mrs. Sinclair had been deluded when, with a cry, she sprang upon the table and tore the lid from it. Out there fell a cascade of children's bricks. It was the toy which he had promised to bring home. This discovery, and the evident confusion which the cripple showed, made the inspector realize that the matter was serious. The rooms were carefully examined. The results all pointed to an abominable crime. The front room was plainly furnished as a sitting room, and led into a small bedroom, which looked out upon the back of one of the wharves. When the wharf and the bedroom window is a narrow Between the wharf and the bedroom window is a narrow strip, which is dry at low tide but is covered at high tide, with at least 4.5 feet of water. The bedroom window was a broad one, and opened from below. Streaks of blood were seen upon the windowsill, and several scattered drops were visible upon the wooden floor of the bedroom. Thrust away behind a curtain in the front room were all the clothes of Mr. Neville Sinclair, with the exception of his coat. His boots, his socks, his hat, and his watch, all were there. There were no signs of violence upon any of these garments, and there were no other traces of Mr. Neville Sinclair. Out of the window he must apparently have gone, for no other exit could be discovered, and the ominous bloodstains upon the sill gave little promise that he could save himself by swimming, for the tide it was at its very highest at the moment of the tragedy. And now, as to the villains who seemed to be immediately implicated in the matter. Lascar was known for being a man of the vilest antecedents, but as by Mrs. Sinclair's story he was known to have been at the foot of the stair within a very few seconds of her husband's appearance at the window, he could hardly have been more than an accessory to the crime. His defence was one of absolute ignorance, and he protested that he had no knowledge as to the doings of Hugh Boone, his lodger, and that he could not account in any way for the presence of the missing gentleman's clothes. So much for the Lascar manager. Now for the sinister cripple who lives upon the second floor of the opium den, and who has certainly the last human being whose eyes rested upon Neville Sinclair. His name is Hugh Boone, and his hideous face is one which owes much to the city. He is a professional beggar, though in order to avoid the police regulations he pretends to a small trade in wax vestas. Some little distance down Threadneedle Street, upon the left-hand side, there is, as you may have remarked, a small angle in the wall. Here it is that this creature takes his daily seat, cross-legged with his tiny stock of matches on his lap, and as he is a piteous spectacle, a small rain of charity descends into the greasy leather cap which lays upon the pavement beside him. I have watched the fellow more than once, before ever I thought of making his professional acquaintance, and I have been surprised at the harvest which he has reaped in a short time. His appearance, you see, is so remarkable about him. A shock of orange hair, a pale face disfigured by a horrible scar, which, by its contraction, has turned up the outer edge of his upper lip, a bulldog chin, and a pair of very penetrating dark eyes, which present a singular contrast to the colour of his hair. All mark him out from amid the common crowd of mendicants, and so too does his wit, for he is ever ready with a reply to any piece of chaff which may be thrown at him by passers-by. This is the man whom we now learn to have been the lodger of the opium den, and to have been the last man to see the gentleman of whom we are in quest. But a cripple, said I. What could he have done single-handed against a man in the prime of his life? He is a cripple in the sense that he walks with a limp, but in other respects he appears to be a powerful and well-nurtured man. Surely your medical experience would tell you, Watson, that weakness in one limb is often compensated for by exceptional strength in the others. Pray continue your narrative. Mrs. Sinclair had fainted at the sight of the blood upon the window, and she was escorted home in a cab by the police, as her presence could be of no help to them in their investigations. Inspector Barton, who had charge of the case, made a very careful examination of the premises, but without finding anything, without finding anything which threw any light upon the matter. One mistake had been made in not arresting Boone instantly. As he was allowed some minutes during which he might have communicated with his friend, but this fault was soon remedied, and he was seized and searched, without anything being found which could incriminate him. There were, it is true, some bloodstains upon his right shirt sleeve. But he pointed to his ring finger, which had been cut near the nail, and explained that the bleeding came from there, adding that as he had been to the window not long before, and that the stains which had been observed there came doubtless from the same source. He denied strenuously ever having seen Mr. Neville Sinclair, and swore that the presence of the clothes in his room was as much a mystery to him as to the police. As to Mrs. Sinclair's assertion that she had actually seen her husband at the window, he declared that she must have. He was removed, loudly protesting, to the police station, while the inspector remained upon the premises in the hope that the ebbing tide might afford some fresh clue. Hang on. Sherlock's blacking it. Alright. And it did, though they hardly found upon the mudbank what they had feared to find. It was Neville Sinclair's coat, and not Neville Sinclair, which lay uncovered as the tide receded. And what do you think they found in the pockets? I cannot imagine. No, I don't think you would guess. It's stuffed with pennies and halfpennies. 421 pennies and 270 halfpennies. It was no wonder that it had not been swept away by the tide. But a human body is a different matter. There's a fierce eddy between the wharf and the house, and it seemed likely enough that the weighted coat had remained when the stripped body had been sucked away into the river. But I understand that all the other clothes were found in the room. Would the body be dressed in a coat alone? No, sir, but the fact may be met speciously enough. Suppose that this man Boone had thrust Neville St. Clair through the window. There is no human eye which could have seen the deed. Well, what would he do then? It would, of course, instantly strike him that he must get rid. He would seize the coat then, and be in the act of throwing it out when it would occur to him that it would swim and not sink. He has little time, for he's heard the scuffle downstairs, when the wife tried to force her way up, and perhaps he has already heard from his Lascar confederate that the police are hurrying up the street. There is not an instant to be lost. He rushes to some secret hoard where he has accumulated the fruits of his beggary, and he stuffs all the coins upon which he can lay his hands into the pockets to make sure the coat's sinking. He throws it out, and would have done the same with the other garments had not he heard the rush of steps below, and only just had time to close the window when the police appeared. It certainly sounds feasible, a working hypothesis for want of a better. Boone, as I have told you, was arrested and taken to the station, but it could not be shown that there had ever before been anything against him. He had for years been known as a professional beggar, but his life appeared to have been a very quiet and innocent one. There the matter stands at present, and the questions which have been solved, what Neville St. Clair was doing in the opium den, what happened to him when there, where is he now, and what Hugh Boone has to do with his disappearance, are all as far from a solution as ever. I confess that I cannot recall any case within my experience which looked at the first glance so simple, and yet which presented such difficulties. While Sherlock Holmes had been detailed events, we had been whirling it through the outskirts of the great town until the last straggling houses had been left behind, and we rattled along with a country hedge upon either side of us. Just as he finished, however, we drove through two scattered villages, where a few lights still glimmered in the windows. We are on the outskirts of Lee, said my companion. We have touched on 3 English counties in our short drive, starting in Middlesex, passing over an angle of Surrey, and ending in Kent. See that light among the trees? That is the Cedars, and beside that lamp sits a woman whose anxious ears have already, I have little doubt, caught the clink of our little horse's feet. But Baker Street? I asked. Because there are many inquiries which must be made out here. Mrs. St. Clair has most kindly put 2 rooms at my disposal, and you may rest assured that she will have nothing but a welcome for my friend and colleague. I hate to meet her, Watson, when I have no news of her husband. Here we are. Whoa there, whoa! We had pulled up in front of a large villa, which stood within its own grounds. A stable boy had run out to the horse's head, and springing down, I followed Holmes up the small, winding gravel drive which led to the house. As we approached, the door flew open, and a little blonde woman stood in the opening, clad in some sort of light muslin de soie, which with a touch of fluffy pink chiffon at her neck and wrists. She stood with her figure outlined against the flood of light, one hand upon the door, one half raised in her eagerness, her body slightly bent, her head and face protruded, with eager eyes and parted lips, a standing question. Well, she cried, well? Then, seeing that there were 2 of us, she gave a cry of hope, which sank into a groan as she saw that my companion shook his head and shrugged his shoulders. No good news? None. No bad? No. Well, thank God for that. But come in, you must be weary. You've had a long day. This is my friend, Dr. Watson. He has been of most vital use to me in several of my cases, and a lucky chance has made it possible for me to bring him out and associate him with this investigation. I am delighted to see you, she said, pressing my hand warmly. You will, I am sure, forgive anything that may be wanting in our arrangements, when you consider the blow which has so suddenly come upon us. Dear madam, said I am an old campaigner, and if I were not, I can very well see that no apology is needed. If I can be of any assistance, either to you or my friend here, I shall be indeed happy. Now, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, said the lady as we entered a well-lit dining-room, upon the table of which a cold supper had been laid out. I should very much like to ask you 1 or 2 plain questions, to which I beg that you will give a plain answer. Certainly, madam. Do not trouble about my feelings. I'm not hysterical, nor given to fainting. I simply wish to hear your real opinion. Upon what point? In your heart of hearts, do you think that Neville is alive? Sherlock Holmes seemed to be embarrassed by the question. Frankly, now, she repeated, standing upon the rug and looking keenly down at him as he leaned back in a basket chair. Frankly, then, madam, I do not. You think that he is dead? I do. Murdered? I don't say that. Perhaps. And on what day did he meet his death? On Monday. Then perhaps, Mr. Holmes, you will be good enough to explain how it is that I have received a letter from him today. Sherlock Holmes sprang out of his chair as if he had been galvanized. What? He roared. Yes, today. She stood smiling, holding up a little slip of paper in the air. May I see it? Certainly. He snatched it from her in his eagerness, and smoothing it out upon the table, he drew over the lamp and examined it intently. I had left my chair and was gazing at it over his shoulder. The envelope was a very coarse one, and was stamped with the Gravesend postmark, and with the date of that very day, or rather the day before, for it was considerably after midnight. Coarse writing, murmured Holmes. Surely this is not your husband's writing, madam? No, but the enclosure is. I perceive also that whoever addressed the envelope had to go and inquire as to the address. How can you tell that? The name, you see, is in perfectly black ink, which has dried itself. The rest is of the greyish colour, which shows that blotting paper has been used. If it had been written straight off and then blotted, none of it would be of the deep black shade. This man has written the name, and there has been a pause before he wrote the address, which can only mean that he was not familiar with it. It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles. Let us now see the letter. Ha, there has been an enclosure here. Yes, there was a ring, his signet ring. And you are sure that this is your husband's hand? One of his hands. One? His hand when he wrote hurriedly. It is very unlike his usual writing, and yet I know it well. Dearest, do not be frightened. All will come well. There is a huge error, which it may take me some little time to rectify. Wait in patience. Neville. Written in pencil upon the flyleaf of a book. Octavo size. No watermark. Posted today in Gravesend by a man with a dirty thumb. And the flap has been gummed, if I am not very much in error, by a person who has been chewing tobacco. And you have no doubt that this is your husband's hand, madam? None. Neville wrote those words. And they were posted today at Gravesend. Well, Mrs. Sinclair, the clouds lighten, though I should not venture to say that the danger is over. And he must be alive, Mr. Holmes. Unless this is a very clever forgery to put us on the wrong scent. The ring, after all, proves nothing. May have been taken from him. No, it is his very own handwriting. Very well. It may, however, have been written on Monday and only posted today. That is possible. If so, between him, and there is so keen a sympathy between us, I should know if evil can him. On the very day that I saw him last, he cut himself in the bedroom, and yet I, in the dining room, rushed upstairs instantly with the utmost certainty that something had happened. Do you think I would be able to respond to such a trifle and yet be ignorant of his death? I have seen too much not to know that the impression of a woman may be more valuable than the conclusion of an analytical reasoner. And in this letter you certainly have a very strong piece of evidence to corroborate your view. But if your husband is alive and able to write letters, why should he remain away from you? I cannot imagine. It's unthinkable. And yet, on Monday he made no remarks before leaving you. No? And you were much surprised to see him at Swandon Lane? Very much so. Was the window open? Yes. Then he might have called to you? He might. He only, as I understand, gave an inarticulate cry. Yes. I call for help, you thought? Yes, he waved his hands. But it might have been a cry of surprise. Astonishment at the unexpected sight of you might cause him to throw up his hands. It is possible. And you thought he was pulled back? Well, he disappeared so suddenly. He might have left back. Did you not see anyone else in the room? No, but this horrible man confessed to having been there, and Alaska was at the foot of the stairs. Quite so. Your husband, as far as you could see, had his ordinary clothes on, but without his collar or tie. I distinctly saw his bare throat. Had he ever spoke of Swandam Lane? Never. Had he ever showed any signs of having taken opium? Never. Thank you, Mrs. Sinclair. Those are the principal points about which I wish to be absolutely clear. We shall now have a little supper and then retire, for we may have a very busy day tomorrow. A large and comfortable double-bedded room had been placed at our disposal, and I was quickly between the sheets, for I was weary after my night of adventure. Holmes was a man, however, who, when he had an unsolved problem upon his mind, would go for days or even for a week without rest, turning it over, rearranging his facts, looking at it from every point of view until he had either fathomed it or convinced himself that his data were insufficient. It was soon evident to me that he was now preparing for an all-night sitting. He took off his coat and waistcoat, put on a large blue dressing gown, and then wandered about the room collecting pillows from his bed and cushions from the sofa and armchairs. With these he constructed a sort of Eastern divan, upon which he perched himself cross-legged, with an ounce of shag tobacco and a box of matches laid out in front of him. In the dim light of the lamp I saw him sitting there, an old briar pipe between his lips, his eyes fixed vacantly upon a corner of the ceiling, the blue smoke curling up from him, silent, motionless, with the light shining upon his strong yet aquiline features. So he sat as I dropped off to sleep, and so he sat when a sudden exclamation caused me to wake up, and I found the summer sun shining into the apartment. The pipe was still between his lips, the smoke still curled upwards, and the room was full of a dense tobacco haze, but nothing remained of the heap of shag which I had seen upon the previous night. "Awake, Watson?" he asked. "Yes." "Game for a morning drive?" "Certainly." "Then dress. No one is stirring yet, but I know where the stable boy sleeps, and we shall soon have the trap out." He chuckled to himself as he spoke. His eyes twinkled, and he seemed a different man to the sombre thinker of the previous night. As I dressed, I glanced at my watch. It was no wonder that no one was stirring. It was 25 minutes past 4. I had hardly finished when Holmes returned with the news that the stable boy was putting in the horse. "I want to test a little theory of mine," said he, pulling on his boots. "I think, Watson, that you are now standing in the presence of one of the most absolute fools in Europe. I deserve to be kicked from here to Charing Cross, but I think I have the key of the affair now." "And where is it?" I asked, smiling. "In the bathroom," he answered. "Oh yes, I am not joking," he continued, seeing my look of incredulity. "I have just been there, and I have taken it out, and I have got it in this Gladstone bag. Come on, my boy. We shall see whether it will not fit the lock." We made our way downstairs as quietly as possible, and out into the bright morning sunshine. In the road stood our horse and trap, with the half-clad stable boy waiting at the head. We both sprang in, and away we dashed down the London road. Few country carts were stirring, bearing in vegetables to the metropolis, but the lines of villas on either side were as silent and lifeless as some city in a dream. "It has been in some points a singular case," said Holmes, flicking the horse on into a gallop. "I confess that I've been as blind as a mole, but it is better to learn wisdom late than to never to learn it at all. Never to learn it at all." All those T sounds, I can't. Okay. In town, the earliest risers were just beginning to look sleepily from their windows as we drove through the streets of the Surrey side. Passing down the Waterloo Bridge Road, we crossed over the river, and dashing up Wellington Street, wheeled sharply to the right and found ourselves in Bow Street. Sherlock Holmes was well known to the force, and two constables at the door saluted him. One of them held the horse's head, while the other led us in. "Who's on duty?" asked Holmes. "Inspector Bradstreet, sir." "Ah, Bradstreet, how are you?" A tall, stout official had come down the stone-flagged passage, in a peaked cap and frogged jacket. "I wish to have a quiet word with you, Bradstreet." "Certainly, Mr. Holmes. Step into my room here." It was a small, office-like room, with a huge ledger upon the table, and a telephone projecting from the wall. The inspector sat down at his desk. "What can I do for you, Mr. Holmes?" "I called about that beggarman, Boone, the one who was charged with being concerned with the disappearance of Mr. Neville St. Clair of Lee." "Yes, he was brought up and remanded for further inquiries." So I heard. You have him here, in the cells. Is he quiet? Oh, he gives no trouble, but he is a dirty scoundrel. Dirty? Yes, it's all we can do to make him wash his hands, and his face is as black as a tinker's. Well, when once this case has been settled, he'll have a regular prison bath, and I think if you saw him you would agree with me that he needs it. I should like to see him very much. Would you? That's easily done. Come this way, you can leave your bag. No, I think I'll take it. Well, very good. Come this way, if you please. He led us down a passage, opened a barred door, passed down a winding stair, and brought us to a whitewashed corridor with a line of doors on each side. Third on the right is his, said the inspector. Here it is. He quietly shot back a panel in the upper part of the door and glanced through. He's asleep, said he. You can see him very well. We both put our eyes to the grating. The prisoner lay with his face towards us, in a very deep sleep, breathing slowly and heavily. He was a middle-sized man, coarsely clad as became his calling, with a coloured shirt protruding through the rent in his tattered coat. He was, as the inspector had said, extremely dirty, but the grime which covered his face could not conceal its repulsive ugliness. A broad wheal from an old scar ran right across it from eye to chin, and by its contraction had turned up one side of the upper lip, so that 3 teeth were exposed in a perpetual snarl. A shock of very bright red hair grew low over his eyes and forehead. He's a beauty, isn't he? Said the inspector. Well, he certainly needs a wash, remarked Holmes. I had an idea that he might, and I took the liberty of bringing the tools with me. Opened the Gladstone bag as he spoke, and took out, to my astonishment, a very large bath sponge. You are a funny one, chuckled the inspector. Now, if you will have the great goodness to open that door very quietly, we will soon make him cut a much more respectable figure. Well, I don't see why not, said the inspector. He doesn't look a credit to the Bow Street cells, does he? He slipped his key into the lock, and we all very quietly entered the cell. The sleeper half turned, and then settled down once more into a deep slumber. Holmes stooped to the water jug, moistened his sponge, and then rubbed it twice vigorously across and back. Let me introduce you, he shouted, to Mr. Neville St. Clair of Lee, in the county of Kent. Never in my life have I seen such a sight. The man's face peeled off under the sponge like bark from a tree. Gone was the coarse brown tint. Gone, too, was the horrid scar which had seamed it across, and the twisted lip which had given the repulsive sneer to the face. A twitch brought away the tangled red hair, and there, sitting up upon his bed, was a pale, sad-faced, refined-looking man, black-haired and smooth-skinned, rubbing his eyes and staring about him with sleepy bewilderment. Then, suddenly realizing the exposure, he broke into a scream and threw himself down with his face to the pillow. Great heavens! Cried the inspector. It is indeed the missing man. I know him from the photograph. The prisoner turned with a reckless air of a man who abandons himself to his destiny. Be it so, said he. And pray, what am I charged with? With making away with Mr. Nevilleson. Oh, come, you can't be charged with that unless they make a case of attempted suicide out of it, said the inspector with a grin. Well, I've been 27 years in the force, but this really takes the cake. I am Mr. Neville St. Clair, then it's obvious that no crime has been committed, and that, therefore, I am illegally detained. No crime, but a very great error has been committed, said Holmes. You would have done better to have trusted your wife. It was not the wife, it was the children, groaned the prisoner. God help me, I would not have them ashamed of their father. My God, what an exposure! What can I do? Sherlock Holmes sat down beside him on the couch and patted him kindly on the shoulder. If you leave it to a court of law to clear the matter up, said he, of course you can hardly avoid publicity. On the other hand, if you convince the police authorities that there was no possible case against you, I do not know how there is any reason that the details should find their way into the papers. Inspector Bradstreet would, I am sure, make notes upon anything which you might tell us, and submit it to the proper authorities. The case would then never go into court at all. God bless you, said the prisoner passionately. I would have endured imprisonment, even execution, rather than have left my miserable secret as a family blot to my children. You are the first who have ever heard my story. My father was a schoolmaster in Chesterfield, where I received an excellent education, I travelled in my youth, took to the stage, and eventually became a reporter on an evening paper in London. One day, my editor wished to have a series of articles upon begging in the metropolis, and I volunteered to supply them. There was the point from which there was the point from which all my adventures started. It was only by trying begging as an amateur that I could get the facts upon which to base my articles. When an actor, I had of course learned all the secrets of making up, and had been famous in the green room for my skill. I took advantage now of my attainments, painted my face, and to make myself look as pitiable as possible, I made a good scar, and fixed one side of my lip in a twist by the aid of a small slip of flesh-coloured plaster. Then, with the red head of hair and an appropriate dress, I took my station in the busiest part of the city, ostensibly as a match seller, but really as a beggar. For 7 hours I plied my trade, and when I returned home in the evening, I found to my surprise that I had received no less than 26 shillings and fourpence. I wrote my articles and thought little more of the matter, until some time later I backed a bill for a friend and had a writ served upon me for £25. I was at my wits' end where to get the money, but a sudden idea came to me. I begged a fortnight's grace from the creditor, asked for a holiday from my employers, and spent time in the city spent time in begging in the city under my disguise. In 10 days I had the money and had paid the debt. Well, you can imagine how hard it was to settle down to arduous work at £2 a week, when I knew that I could earn as much in a day by smearing my face with a little paint and laying my cap on the ground and sitting still. It was a long fight between my pride and the money, but the dollars won at last, and I threw up reporting, and sat day after day in the corner which I had first chosen, inspiring pity by my ghastly face and filling my pockets with coppers. Only one man knew my secret. He is the keeper of a low den in which I used to lodge at Swandon Lane, where I could every morning emerge as a squalid beggar, and in the evenings transform myself into a well-dressed man about town. This fellow, Alaska, was well paid by me for his rooms, so that I knew that my secret was safe in his possession. Well, very soon I found that I was saving considerable sums of money. I do not mean that any beggar in the streets of London could earn £700 a year, which is less than my average takings, but I had exceptional advantages in my power of making up, and also in a facility of repartee, which improved by practice, and made me quite a recognised character in the city. All day a stream of pennies, varied by silver, poured in upon me, and it was a very bad day in which I failed to take £2. As I grew richer, I grew more ambitious, took a house in the country, and eventually married without anyone having a suspicion as to my real occupation. My dear wife knew that I had business in the city. She little knew what. Last Monday I had finished for the day and was dressing in my room above the opium den, when I looked out of my window and saw, to my horror and astonishment, that my wife was standing in the street, with her eyes full fixed upon me. I gave a cry of surprise and threw up my arms to cover my face, and, rushing to my confidant, the Lascar, entreated him to prevent anyone from coming up to me. I heard her voice downstairs, but knew she could not ascend. Swiftly I threw off my clothes, pulled on those of a beggar, put on my pigments and wig. Even a wife's eyes could not pierce so complete a disguise. And then it occurred to me that there might be a search in the room, and that the clothes might betray me. I threw open the window, reopening by my violence a small cut which I had inflicted upon myself in the bedroom that morning. Then I seized my coat, which was weighed down by the coppers which I had just transferred to it from the leather bag in which I carried my takings. I hurled it out of the window, and it disappeared into the Thames. The other clothes would have followed, but at that moment there was a rush of constables up the stair, and a few minutes after I found, rather, I confess, to my relief, that instead of being identified as Mr. Neville St. Clair, I was arrested as his murderer. I do not know that there is anything else for me to explain. I was determined to preserve my disguise as long as possible, and hence my preference for a dirty face. Knowing that my wife would be terribly anxious, I slipped off my ring and confided it to the Lascar at the moment when no constable was watching me, together with a hurried scrawl, telling her that she had no cause to fear. That note only reached her yesterday, said Holmes. Good God, what a week she must have spent! The police have watched this Lascar, said Inspector Bradstreet, and I can quite understand that he might find it difficult to post a letter unobserved. Probably he handed it to some sailor customer of his who forgot all about it for some days. That was it, said Holmes, nodding approvingly. I have no doubt of it. But have you ever been persecuted for begging? Prosecuted for begging, even? Many times, but what was a fine to me? It must stop here, however, said Bradstreet. If the police are to hush this thing up, there must be no more of Hugh Boone. I have sworn it by the most solemn oaths which a man can take. In that case, I think that it is probable that no further steps may be taken. But if you are found again, then all must come out. I am sure, Mr. Holmes, that we are very much indebted to you for having cleared this matter up. I wish I knew how to reach your results. I reached this one, said my friend, by sitting upon 5 pillows and consuming an ounce of shag tobacco. I think, Watson, that if we drive to Baker Street, we shall just be in time for breakfast. Oh, wait. Cursing in my chat. God damn it, Callum. I think it is literally just you and me now, by the way. So, hey. What time is it? 9 now. I'll probably read like 1 or 2 more. It's okay, I don't actually mind. It's going pretty good. How's it going with you, friend? Oi oi. Alright. The next one's called the Blue Carbuncle. I had called upon my friend Sherlock Holmes upon the 2nd morning after Christmas, with the intention of wishing him the compliments of the season. He was lounging around upon a pipe rack within his reach upon the right, and a pile of crumpled morning papers, evidently newly studied, near at hand. Beside the couch was a wooden chair, and on the angle of the back hung in a very seedy and disreputable hard felt hat, which much the worse for wear, and cracked in several places. A lens and a forceps lying upon the seat of the chair suggested that the hat had been suspended in this manner for the purpose of examination. You are engaged, said I. Perhaps I interrupt you. Not at all. I am glad to have a friend with whom I can discuss my results. The matter is a perfectly trivial one. He jerked his thumb in the direction of the old hat. But there are points in connection with it which are not entirely devoid of interest, and even of instruction. I seated myself in his armchair, and warmed my hands before his crackling fire, for a sharp frost had set in, and the windows were thick with the ice crystals. I suppose, I remarked, that, homely as it looks, this thing has some deadly story linked on to it, that it is the clue which will guide you to the solution of some mystery and the punishment of some crime. No, no, no crime, said Sherlock Holmes, laughing. Only one of those whimsical little incidents which will happen when you have 4 million human beings all jostling each other within the space of a few square miles. Amid the action and the reaction of so dense a swarm of humanity, every possible combination of events may be expected to take place, and many a little problem will be presented which may be striking and bizarre without being criminal. We have already had experience of such. So much so, I remarked. Out of the last 6 cases which I have added to my notes, 3 have been entirely free of any legal crime. Precisely. You allude to my attempt to recover the Irene Adler papers, to the singular case of Miss Mary Sutherland, and to the adventure of the man with the twisted lip. Well, I have no doubt that this small matter will fall into the same innocent category. You know Peterson, the commissionaire? Yes. It is to him that this trophy belongs. It's his hat. No, no, he found it. The owner is unknown. I beg that you will look upon it, not as a battered billycock, but as an intellectual problem. And first, as to how it came here. It arrived upon Christmas morning in company with a good fat goose, which is, I have no doubt, roasting at this moment in front of Peterson's fire. The facts are these. About 4 o'clock on Christmas morning, Peterson, who, as you know, is a very honest fellow, was returning from some small jollification, and was making his way homeward down Tottenham Court Road. In front of him he saw, in the gaslight, a tallish man, walking with a slight stagger and carrying a white goose slung over his shoulder. As he reached the corner of Goodge Street, a row broke out between this stranger and a little knot of roughs. One of the latter knocked off the man's hat, on which he raised his stick to defend himself, and, swinging it over his head, smashed the shop window behind him. Peterson had rushed forward to protect the stranger from his assailants, but the man, shocked at having broken the window, and seeing an official-looking person in uniform rushing towards him, dropped the goose, took to his heels, and vanished amid the labyrinth of small streets which lie at the back of Tottenham Court Road. The roughs had also fled at the appearance of Peterson, so that he was left in possession of the field of battle, and also of the spoils of victory, in the shape of this battered hat, and a most unimpeachable Christmas goose, which surely he restored to their owner. My dear fellow, there lies the problem. It is true that "For Mrs. Henry Baker" was printed upon a small card which was tied to the bird's left leg, and it is also true that the initials "H.B." are legible upon the lining of this hat. But as there are some thousands of Bakers and some hundreds of Henry Bakers in this city of ours, it is not easy to restore lost property to any one of them. Well, what then did Peterson do? He brought round both the hat and goose to me on Christmas morning, knowing that even the smallest problems are of interest to me. The goose we retained until this morning, when there were signs that, in spite of the slight frost, it would be well that it were eaten without unnecessary delay. Its finder has carried it off, therefore, to fulfil the ultimate destiny of the goose, while I continue to retain the hat of the unknown gentleman who lost his Christmas dinner. Did he not advertise? No. Then what clue could you have as to his identity? Only as much as we can deduce. From his hat. Precisely. But you're joking. What can you gather from this old battered felt? Here is my lens. You know my methods. What can you gather yourself as to the individuality of the man who has worn this article? I took the tattered object into my hands, and turned it over rather ruefully. It was a very ordinary black hat, of the usual round shape, hard and much the worse for wear. The lining had been of red silk, but was a good deal discoloured. There was no maker's name, but, as Holmes had remarked, the initials "H.B." scrawled upon one side. Oh, sorry. um, yes, the initials "H.B." were scrawled upon one side. It was pierced in the brim for a hat securer, but the elastic was missing. For the rest, it was cracked, exceedingly dusty, and spotted in several places, although there seemed to have been some attempt to hide the discoloured patches by smearing them with ink. "I can see nothing," said I, handing it back to my friend. "On the contrary, Watson, you can see everything. You fail, however, to reason from what you see. You are too timid in drawing your inferences." "Then pray tell me what it is that you can infer from this hat." He picked it up, and gazed at it in the peculiar introspective fashion which was characteristic of him. "It is perhaps less suggestive than it might have been," he remarked, "and yet there are a few inferences which are very distinct, and a few others which represent at least a strong balance of probability. That the man was highly intellectual is of course obvious upon the face of it, and also that he was fairly well to do within the last 3 years, although he has now fallen upon evil days. He had foresight, but has less now than formerly, pointing to a moral retrogression, which, when taken with the decline in his fortunes, seems to indicate some evil influence, probably drink, at work upon him. This may account also for the obvious fact that his wife has ceased to love him." "My dear Holmes!" "He has, however, retained some degree of self-respect," he continued, disregarding my remonstrance. "He is a man who leads a sedentary life, goes out little, is out of training entirely, is middle-aged, has grizzled hair which he has cut within the last few days, and which he anoints with lime cream. These are the most patent facts which are to be deduced from this hat. Also, by the way, that is that it is extremely improbable that he has gas laid on at his house." "You are certainly joking, Holmes." "Not in the least. Is it possible that even now, when I give you these results, you are unable to see how they are attained?" "Oh, I have no doubt that I am very stupid, but I must confess that I am unable to follow you. For example, how did you deduce that the man was an intellectual?" For answer, Holmes clapped the hat upon his head. It came right over the forehead and settled upon the bridge of his nose. "It is a question of cubic capacity," said he. "A man with so large a brain must have something in it." You would think, but no. The decline of his fortunes, then? This hat is 3 years old. These flat brims curled at the edge came in then. It is a hat of the very best quality. Look at the band of ribbed silk, and the excellent lining. If this man could afford to buy so expensive a hat 3 years ago, and has had no hat since, then he has assuredly gone down in the world." Well, that is clear enough, certainly, but how about the foresight and the moral retrogression? Sherlock Holmes laughed. Here is the foresight, he said, putting his finger upon the little disc and loop of the hat securer. They are never sold upon hats. If this man ordered one, it is a sign of a certain amount of foresight, since he went out of his way to take this precaution against the wind. But since we see that he has broken the elastic and has not troubled to replace it, it is obvious that he has less foresight now than formerly, which is distinct proof of a weakening nature. On the other hand, he has endeavoured to conceal some of these stains upon the felt by daubing them with ink, which is a sign that he has not entirely lost his self respect. Your reasoning is certainly plausible. The further points, that he is middle aged, that his hair is grizzled, and that it has recently been cut, and that he uses lime cream, are all to be gathered from a close examination of the lower part of the lining. The lens discloses a large number of hair ends, clean cut by the scissors of a barber. They all appear to be adhesive, and there is a distinct odour of lime cream. This dust, you will observe, is not the gritty grey dust of the street, but the fluffy brown dust of the house, showing that it has been hung up indoors for most of the time, where the marks of moisture upon the inside are positive proof that the wearer perspired very freely, and could therefore hardly be in the best of training. But his wife! You said that she had ceased to love him. This hat has not been brushed for weeks. When I see you, my dear Watson, with a week's accumulation of dust upon your hat, and when your wife allows you to go out in such a state, I shall fear that you also have been unfortunate enough to lose your wife's affection. That he might be a bachelor. Nay, he was bringing home the goose as a peace offering to his wife. Remember the card upon the bird's leg. You have an answer to everything, but how on earth do you deduce that the gas is not laid on in his house? One tallow stain, or even two, might come by chance, but when I see no less than five, I think that there can be little doubt that the individual must be brought into frequent contact with burning tallow, walks upstairs at night, probably with his hat in one hand and a guttering candle in the other. Anyhow, he never got tallow stains from a gas jet. Are you satisfied? Well, it is very ingenious, said I, laughing. But since, as you said just now, there has been no crime committed and no harm done save the loss of a goose, all this seems to be rather a waste of energy. Sherlock Holmes had opened his mouth to reply when the door flew open, and Peterson, the commissionaire, rushed into the apartment with flushed cheeks and the face of a man who was dazed with astonishment. The goose, Mr. Holmes! The goose, sir! He gasped. Eh? What of it, then? Has it returned to life and flapped off through the kitchen window? Holmes twisted himself round on the sofa to get a better view of the man's excited face. See here, sir. See what my wife found in its crop. He held out his hand, and displayed upon the centre of his palm brilliantly scintillating blue stone, not a bean in size, but of such purity and radiance that it twinkled like an electric point in the dull hollow of his hand. Sherlock Holmes sat up with a whistle. By Jove, Peterson, said he, this is a treasure trove indeed. I suppose you know what we've got. A diamond, sir? A precious stone. It cuts into glass as though it were putty. It's more than a precious stone. It's the precious stone. Not the Countess of Morca's Blue Carbuncle, I exclaimed. Precisely so. I ought to know its size and shape, seeing that I have read the advertisement about it in the Times every day lately. It is absolutely unique, and its value can only be conjectured, but the reward offered for it of £1,000 is certainly not within the 20th part of the market price. £1,000! Great Lord of mercy! The commissionaire plumped down into the chair and stared from one to the other of us. That is the reward, and I have reason to know that there are sentimental considerations in the background which would induce the Countess to part with half her fortune if she could but recover the gem. It was lost, if I remember all right, at the Hotel Cosmopolitan, I remarked. Precisely so. On December 22nd, just 5 days ago, John Horner, a plumber, was accused of having abstracted it from the lady's jewel case. The evidence against him was so strong that the case has been referred to the Assize. I have some account of the matter here, I believe. He rummaged amid his papers, glancing over the dates, until at last he smoothed one out, doubled it over, and read the following paragraph. Hotel Cosmopolitan jewel robbery. John Horner, 26, plumber, was brought up upon the charge of having, upon the 22nd just says, abstracted from the jewel case of the Countess of Morca the valuable gem known as the Blue Carbuncle. James Ryder, upper attendant at the hotel, gave his evidence to the effect that he had shown Horner up to the dressing room of the Countess of Morca upon the day of the robbery, in order that he might solder the second bar of the grate, which was loose. He had remained with Horner some little time, but had finally been called away. On returning, he found that Horner had disappeared, that the bureau had been forced open, and that the small morocco casket in which, as it afterwards transpired, the Countess was accustomed to keep her jewel, was lying empty upon the dressing table. Ryder instantly gave the alarm, and Horner was arrested the same evening, but neither upon his person or in his rooms. Catherine Cusack, maid to the Countess, deposed to having heard Ryder's cry of dismay on discovering the robbery, and to having rushed into the room, where she found matters as described by the last witness. Inspector Bradstreet, B Division, gave evidence as to the arrest of Horner, who struggled frantically and protested his innocence in the strongest terms. Evidence of a previous conviction for robbery having been given against the prisoner, the magistrate refused to deal summarily with the offence, but referred it to the assizes. Horner, who had shown proceedings, fainted away at the conclusion and was carried out of court. So much for the police court, said Holmes thoughtfully, tossing aside the paper. The question for us now to solve is the sequence of events leading from a rifled jewel case at one end to the crop of a goose in Tottenham Court Road at the other. You see, Watson, our little deductions have suddenly assumed a much more important and less innocent aspect. Here is the stone. The stone came from the goose, and the goose came from Mr. Henry Baker, the gentleman with the bad hat and all the other characteristics with which I have bored you. So now we must set ourselves very seriously to finding this gentleman and ascertaining what part he has played in this little mystery. And the undoubtedly an advertisement in the evening papers. If this fails, I shall have recourse to other methods. What will you say? Give me a pencil and that slip of paper. Now then. Found at the corner of Goodge Street, a goose and a black felt hat. Mr. Henry Baker can have the same by applying at 6:30 this evening at 221B Baker Street. That is clear and concise. Very, but will he see it? Well, he is sure to keep an eye on the papers, since to a poor man the loss is a heavy one. He was clearly so scared by his mischance in breaking the window and by the approach of Peterson that he thought nothing of I can do words, I promise. That he thought of nothing but fun. But since then he must have bitterly regretted the impulse which caused him to drop his bird. Then again, the introduction of his name will cause him to see it, for everyone who knows him will direct his attention to it. Here you are, Peterson. Run down to the advertising agency and have this put in the evening papers. In which, sir? Oh, in the Globe, Star, Cornwall, St. James's, Evening News, Standard, Echo, and any others that occur to you. Very well, sir. And this stone? Ah, yes, I shall keep the stone. Thank you. And I say, Peterson, just buy a goose on your way back and leave it here with me. We must have one to give to this gentleman in place of the one which your family is now devouring. When the commissionaire had gone, Holmes took up the stone and held it against the light. Said he. See how it glints and sparkles. Of course, it is a nucleus and focus of crime. Every good stone is. They are the devil's pet baits. In the larger and older jewels, every facet may stand for a bloody deed. This stone is not yet 20 years old. It was found in the banks of the Amoy River in southern China, and is remarkable in having every characteristic of the carbuncle, save that it is blue in shade instead of ruby red. In spite of its youth, it has already a sinister history. There have been 2 murders, a vitriol throwing, a suicide, and several robberies brought about for the sake of this 40-grain weight of crystal. Who would think so pretty a toy would be a purveyor to the gallows and the prison? I'll lock it up in my strong box now, and drop a line to the Countess to say that we have it. Do you think that this man Horner is innocent? I can't tell. Well then, do you imagine that this other one, Henry Baker, had anything to do with the matter? It is, I think, much more likely that Henry Baker is an absolutely innocent man, who had no idea that the bird he was carrying was of considerably more value than if it were made of solid gold. That, however, I shall determine by a very simple test if we have the answer to our advertisement. And you can do nothing until then? Nothing. It's my professional round. But I shall come back in the evening at the hour you have mentioned, for I should like to see the solution of so tangled a business. Very glad to see you. I dine at 7. There's Woodcock, I believe. By the way, In view of recent occurrences, perhaps I ought to ask Mrs. Hudson to examine its crop. I had been delayed at a case, and it was therefore a little after 6:30 when I found myself in Baker Street once more. As I approached the house, I saw a tall man in a Scotch bonnet, with a coat which was buttoned up to his chin, waiting outside the bright semicircle which was thrown from the fanlight. Just as I arrived, the door was opened, and we were shown up together to Holmes's room. "Mr. Henry Baker, I believe," said he, during greeting the visitor with the easy air of geniality that he could so readily assume. "Pray take this chair by the fire, Mr. Baker. It's a cold night, and I observe that your circulation has more adapted for summer than for winter. Ah, Watson, you've come at just the right time. Is that your hat, Mr. Baker?" "Yes, sir, that is undoubtedly my hat." He was a large man, with rounded shoulders, a massive head, and a broad, intelligent face, sloping down to a pointed beard of grizzled brown, a touch of red in nose and cheeks, and a slight tremor of the extended hand, recalled Holmes's surmise as to his habits. His rusty black frock coat right up in front, with the collar turned up, and his lank wrists protruded from his sleeves without a sign of cuff or shirt. He spoke in a slow staccato fashion, choosing his words with care, and gave the impression generally of a man of learning and letters who had ill usage at the hands of fortune. We've retained these things for some days," said Holmes, "because we expected to see an advertisement from you giving your address. I'm at a loss to know why you did not advertise." Our visitor gave a rather shamefaced laugh. "As plentiful with me as they once were," he remarked. "I have no doubt that the gang of roughs who assaulted me had carried off both my hat and the bird. I did not care to spend more money in a hopeless attempt at recovering them." "Very naturally. By the way, about the bird, we were compelled to eat it." "To eat it?" Our visitor half rose from his chair in his excitement. "Yes, it would have been no use to anyone had we not done so. But I presume that this other goose upon the sideboard, which is about the same weight and perfectly fresh, will answer your purpose equally well?" "Oh, certainly, certainly," answered Mr. Baker with a sigh of relief. "Of course, we still have the feathers, legs, on of your bed if you wish." The man burst into a hearty laugh. "They might be useful to me as relics of my adventure," said he. "But beyond that, I can hardly see what use the disjecta membra of my late acquaintance are going to be to me. No, sir. I think that with your permission I shall confine my attentions to the excellent bird which I perceive upon the sideboard." Sherlock Holmes glanced sharply across at me, with a slight shrug of his shoulders. "There is your hat, then, and there your bird," said he. "By the way, would it bore you to tell me where you got the other one from? I'm somewhat of a fowl fancier, and I've seldom seen a better grown goose." "Certainly, sir," said Benson, and tucked his newly gained property under his arm. "There are a few of us who frequent the Alpha Inn, near the museum. We are to be found in the museum itself during the day, you understand. This year our good host, Windigate by name, instituted a goose club, by which, on consideration of some few pence every week, we were each to receive a bird at Christmas. My pence were duly paid, and the rest is familiar to you. I am much indebted to you, sir, for a Scotch bonnet is fitted neither to my years nor my gravity." With a comical pomposity of manner, he bowed solemnly to both of us, and strode off upon his way. "So much for Mr. Henry Baker," said Holmes, when he had closed the door behind him. "It is quite certain that he knows nothing whatsoever about the matter. Are you hungry, Watson, particularly? Then I suggest we turn our dinner into a supper, and follow up this clue while it is still hot." "By all means." It was a bitter night, so we drew on our ulsters, and wrapped cravats about our throats. Outside, the stars were shining coldly in a cloudless sky, and the breath of the passers-by blew out into smoke like so many pistol shots. Our footfalls rang out crisply and loudly as we swung through the Doctor's Quarter, Wimpole Street, Harley Street, and so through Wigmore Street onto Oxford Street. In a quarter of an hour we were in Bloomsbury at the Alpha Inn, which is a small public house at the corner of one of the streets which runs down into Holborn. Holmes pushed open the door of the private bar and ordered 2 glasses of beer from a ruddy-faced, white-aproned landlord. "Your beer should be excellent if it is as good as your geese," said he. "My geese?" The man seemed surprised. Yes, I was speaking only half an hour ago to Mr. Henry Baker, who is a member of your goose club. Ah, yes, I see, but you see, sir, them's not our geese. Indeed, whose then? Well, I got 2 dozen from a salesman in Covent Garden. Indeed, I know some of them. Which was it? Breckenridge is his name. Ah, I don't know him. So good health, landlord, and prosperity to your house. Good night. Now for Mr. Breckenridge, he continued, buttoning up his coat as we came out into the frosty air. Remember, Watson, that though we have so homely a thing as a goose at one end of this chain, we have at the other a man who will certainly get 7 years penal servitude unless we can establish his innocence. It is possible that our inquiry may but confirm his guilt, but in any case we have a line of investigation which has been missed by the police, and which a singular chance has placed in our hands. Let us follow it to the bitter end. Faces to a quick march. We passed across Holborn, down Endell Street, and so through a zigzag of slums to Covent Garden Market. One of the largest stalls bore the name of Breckenridge upon it, and the proprietor, a horsey-looking man, with a sharp face and trim side whiskers, was helping a boy to put up the shutters. Good evening. It's a cold night, said Holmes. The salesman nodded and shot a questioning glance at my companion. Sold out of geese, I see, continued Holmes, pointing at the bare slabs of marble. That you have 500 tomorrow morning. That's no good. Well, there are some on the stall with the gas flare. Ah, but I was recommended to you. Who by? The landlord of the Alpha. Oh, yes, I sent him a couple of dozen. Fine birds they were, too. Now, where did you get them from? To my surprise, the question provoked a burst of anger from the salesman. Now then, mister, said he, with the head cocked and his arms akimbo, what are you driving at? Let's have it straight now. It's straight enough. I would like to know who sold you the geese which you supplied to the Alpha. Well, then I shan't tell you. So now. Oh, it's a matter of no importance, but I don't know why you should be so warm. You'd be as warm, maybe, if you were pestered as I am. When I paid good money for a good article, there should be an end of the business. But it's where are the geese? Who did you sell the geese to? What will you take for the geese? One would think they were the only geese in the world, to hear the fuss that was made over them. Well, I've no connection with any other people who've been making inquiries, said Holmes carelessly. If you won't tell us, the vet is off, that's all. But I'm always ready to back my opinion on a matter of fowls, and I have a fiver on it that the bird I ate is country bred. Well then, you've lost your fiver, for it's town bred, snapped the salesman. I say it is. Well, I don't believe you. Do you think you know more about fowls than I, who've handled them ever since I was a nipper? I tell you, all those birds went to the Alpha were town bred. You'll never persuade me to believe that. Will you bet, then? It's merely taking your money, for I know that I'm right, but I'll have a sovereign on with you, just to teach you not to be obstinate. The salesman chuckled grimly. Bring me the books, Bill, said he. The small boy brought round a small, thin volume, and a great greasy-backed one, laying them out together beneath the hanging lamp. Now then, I thought I was out of geese, but before I finish you'll find that there's still one left in my shop. You see this little book? Well, it's a list of the folk from whom I buy, do you see? Well then, here on this page are the country folk, and the numbers after their names are where the accounts are in the ledger. Now then, you'll see this other page in red ink. Well, that is a list of my town suppliers. Look at the third name. Just read it out to me. Mrs. Oakshott, 116 Brixton Road, 249, read Holmes. Quite so. Now turn that up in the ledger. Holmes turned to the page indicated. 117 Brixton Road, egg and poultry supplier. Now then, what's the last entry? December 22nd, 24 geese at 7 shillings. 6d. Quite so, there you are. And underneath? Sold to Mr. Windigate of the Alpha at 12 shillings. What have you to say now? Holmes looked deeply chagrined. He drew a sovereign from his pocket and threw it down upon the slab, turning away with the air of a man whose disgust is too deep for words. A few yards off, he stopped under a lamp post and laughed in the hearty, noiseless fashion which was peculiar to him. A man with whiskers of that cut and the pink un protruding from his pocket. "You can always draw him by a bet," said he. I dare say that if I had put £100 down in front of him, that man would not have given me such complete information as was drawn from him by the idea that he was doing me on a wager. Well, Watson, we are, I fancy, nearing the end of our quest. The only point which remains to be determined is whether we should go on to this Mrs. Oakshott tonight, or whether we should reserve it for tomorrow. It is clear from what that surly fellow said that there are others besides ourselves who are anxious about the matter, and I should— His remarks were suddenly cut short by a loud hubbub, which broke out from the stall which we had just left. A little rat-faced fellow, standing in the centre of a circle of yellow light, which was thrown by the swinging lamp, while Breckenridge, the salesman, framed in the door of his stall, was shaking his fist fiercely at the cringing figure. "I've had enough of you and your geese," he shouted. "I wish you were all at the devil together. If you come pestering me any more with your silly talk, I'll set the dogs on you. You bring Mrs. Oakshott here, and I'll answer her. But what have you to do with it? Did I buy the geese off you?" "No, but one of them was mine, all the same," whined the little man. "Well, then ask Mrs. Oakshott for it." "She told me to ask you." "Well, you can ask the King of Prussia for all I care. I've had—" He rushed fiercely forwards, and the inquirer flitted away into the darkness. "Ah, this may save us a visit to Brixton Road," whispered Holmes. "Come with me, and we'll see what is to be made of this fellow." Striding through the scattered knots of people who lounged round these flaring stalls, my companion speedily overtook the little man, and touched him upon the shoulder. He sprang round, and I could see in the gaslight that every vestige of colour had driven from his face. "Who are you, then? What do you want?" he asked, in a quavering voice. "You will excuse me," said Holmes blandly, "but I could not help overhearing the questions which you put to the salesman just now. Be of assistance to you." "You? Who are you? And how could you know anything of the matter?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes. It's my business to know what other people don't know." "But you can know nothing of this." "Excuse me, I know everything of it. You are endeavouring to trace some geese which were sold by Mrs. Oakshott of Brixton Road to a salesman named Breckenridge, by him in turn to Mr. Windigate of the Alpha, and by him to his club, of which Mr. Henry Baker is a member." "Oh, sir, you are the very man whom I have longed to meet," cried the little fellow with his outstretched hands and quivering fingers. "I can hardly explain to you how interested I am in this matter." Sherlock Holmes, which was passing. "In that case, we had better discuss it in a cosy room rather than in this wind-swept market-place," said he. "But pray tell me, before we go farther, who is it that I have the pleasure of assisting?" The man hesitated for an instant. "My name is John Robertson," he answered, with a sidelong glance. "No, no, the real name," said Holmes sweetly. "It's always awkward doing business with an alias." A flush sprang to the cheeks of the stranger. "Well, then," said he, "my real name is James Ryder." "Precisely so. Head attendant at the Hotel Cosmopolitan. Pray step into the cab, and I shall soon be able to tell you everything that you wish to know." The little man smiled to the other of us with half-frightened, half-hopeful eyes, as one who is not sure whether he is on the verge of a windfall or of a catastrophe. When he stepped into the cab, and in half an hour we were back in the sitting-room at Baker Street. Nothing had been said during our drive, but the high, thin breathing of our new companion, and the claspings and unclaspings of his hands, spoke of the nervous tension within him. "Here we are," said Holmes cheerily, as we filed into the room. "Fire looks very seasonable in this weather. You look cold, Mr. Ryder. Pray take the basket chair. I'll just put on my slippers before we settle this little matter of yours. Now then, you want to know what became of those geese? Yes, sir. Or rather, I fancy, of that goose. It was one bird, I imagine, in which you were interested. White, with a black bar across the tail." Ryder quivered with emotion. "Oh, sir," he cried, "can you tell me where it went to? It came here." "Here?" "Yes, and a most remarkable bird it proved. I don't wonder that you should take an interest in it. It laid an egg after it was dead. The bonniest, brightest little blue egg that ever was seen. I have it here in my museum." Our visitor staggered to his feet and clutched the mantelpiece with his right hand. Holmes unlocked his strong-box and held up the blue card, shone out like a star with a cold, brilliant, many-pointed radiance. Ryder stood glaring, with a drawn face, uncertain whether to claim or to disown it. "The game's up, Ryder," said Holmes quietly. "Hold up, man, or you'll be into the fire. Give him an arm back to his chair, Watson. He's not got blood enough to go in for felony with impunity. Give him a dash of brandy. So, now he looks more human. What a shrimp it is, to be sure." For a moment he had staggered and nearly fallen, but the brandy brought a tinge of colour into his cheeks, and he sat staring with frightened eyes at his accuser. "I have ink in my hands, and all the proofs which I could possibly need, so there's little which you need tell me. Still, that little may as well be cleared up to make the case complete. You had heard, Ryder, of this blue stone in the Countess of Morca's." "It was Catherine Cusack who told me of it," he said, in a crackling voice. "I see, her ladyship's waiting maid. Well, the temptation of sudden wealth so easily acquired was too much for you, as it had been for better men before you. But you are not very scrupulous in the means you used. It seems to me, Ryder, that there is the making of a very pretty villain in you. You knew that this man Horner, the plumber, had done that before, and that suspicion would rest more readily upon him. What did you do then? You made some small job in the lady's room, you and your confederate Cusack, and you managed that he should be the man sent for. Then, when he left, you rifled the jewel case, raised the alarm, and had this unfortunate man arrested. You then—" Ryder threw himself down suddenly upon the rug, and clutched at my companion's knees. "For God's sake, have mercy!" he shrieked. "Think of my father, or my mother, it would break their hearts. I never went wrong before, I never will again, I swear it. I'll swear it on a Bible. Oh, don't bring it to court, for Christ's sake, don't." "Back into your chair," said Holmes sternly. "It's all very well to cringe and crawl now, but you thought little of this poor Horner in the dock for a crime which he knew nothing of." "I'll fly, Mr. Holmes. I'll leave the country, sir. Then the charge against him will break down." "Huh. We will talk about that. And now let us hear a true account of the next act. How came the goose into the stone? How came the stone into the goose? And how came the goose into the open market? Tell us the truth, for there lies our only hope of safety." Ryder passed his tongue over his parched lips. "I'll tell you it just as it happened, sir," said he. "It seemed to me that it would be for the best for me to get away with the stone at once, for I did not know at what moment the police might not take it into their heads to search me and my room. There was no place about the hotel where it would be safe. I went out, as if on some commission, and I made for my sister's house. She'd married a man named Oakshott, and lived in Brixton Road, where she fattened fowls for the market. All the way there, every man I met seemed to me to be a policeman or a detective, and for all that it was a cold night, the sweat was pouring down my face before I came to the Brixton Road. My sister asked me what was the matter, and why I was so pale, but I told her that I had been upset by the jewel robbery at the hotel. Then I went into the backyard and smoked what would be best to do. I had a friend once called Maudsley, who went to the bed, and has just been serving his time in Pentonville. One day he had met me, and fell into talk about the way of thieves and how they could get rid of what they stole. I knew that he would be true for me, for I knew one or two things about him. So I made up my mind to go right on to Kilburn where he lived, and take him into my confidence. He would show me how to turn the stone into money, but how to get to him in safety. I thought the agonies I had gone through in coming from the hotel. I might at any moment be seized and searched, and there would be the stone in my waistcoat pocket. I was leaning against the wall at the time and looking at the geese, which were waddling about round my feet. And suddenly an idea came into my head which showed me how I could beat this best detective that ever lived. My sister had told me some weeks before that I might have the pick of her geese for a Christmas present, and I knew that she was always as good as her word. I could take my goose now, and in it I would carry my stone to Kilburn. There was a little shed in the yard, and behind this I drove one of the birds. A fine big one, white with a barred tail. I caught it, and prying its bill open, I thrust the stone down its throat as far as my finger could reach. The bird gave a gulp, and I felt the stone pass along its gullet and down into its crop. But the creature flapped and struggled, and out came my sister to know what was the matter. As I turned to speak to her, the brute broke loose, and fluttered off among the others. "Whatever were you doing with that bird, Jem?" she asks. "Well," said I, "you said you'd give me one for Christmas, and I was feeling which one was the fattest." "Oh," says she, "we've set yours aside for you. Jem's bird, we call it. It's the big white one over yonder. There's 26 of them, which makes one for you, and one for us, and 2 dozen for the market. Thank you, Maggie, says I, but if it's all the same to you, I'd rather have that one I was handling just now. The other's a good 3 pound heavier, said she, and we fattened it expressly for you. Have the other, and I'll take it now, said I. Oh, just as you like, she said, a little huffed. Which is it you want, then? That white one with the barred tail, right in the middle of the flock. Oh, very well, kill it and take it with you. Well, I did what you said, Mr. Holmes, and I carried the bird all the way to Kilburn. I told my pal what I'd done, for he was a man that it was easy to tell a thing like that to. He laughed till he choked, and we got a knife and opened the goose, and my heart turned to water. There was no sign of the stone, and I knew that some terrible mistake had occurred. I rushed back to my sister's and hurried into the backyard, but there was not a bird to be seen there. Where are they all, Maggie? I cried. Gone to the dealers, Jem. Which dealers? Breckenridge, of Covent Garden. But was there another with a barred tail? I asked. The same as the one I chose. Yes, Jem, there were two barred-tailed ones, and I could never tell them apart. Well, then, of course I saw it all, and I ran off as hard as my feet would carry me to this man Breckenridge. But he had sold a lot at once, and not one word would he tell me as to where they'd gone. You heard him yourselves tonight. Well, he's always answered me like that. My sister thinks that I think that I am myself, and now I am branded myself a thief, without ever having touched the wealth for which I sold my character. God help me! He burst into convulsive sobbing, with his face buried in his hands. There was a long silence, broken only by his heavy breathing and by the measured tapping of Sherlock Holmes's fingertips upon the edge of the table. Then my friend rose and threw open the door. Get out, said he. What, sir? Oh, heaven bless you! No more words. Get out. And no more words were needed. I got upon the stairs, the bang of a door and the crisp rattle of running footfalls from the street. After all, Watson, said Holmes, reaching up his hand for his clay pipe, I am not retained by the police to supply their deficiencies. If Horner were in danger, it would be another thing, but this fellow will not appear against him, and the case must collapse. I suppose that I'm committing a felony, but it's just possible that I'm saving a soul. This fellow will not go wrong again. He's too terribly frightened. Send him to jail now, and you could make him a jailbird for life. Besides, it's the season of forgiveness. Chance has put in our way a most singular and whimsical problem, and its solution its own reward. If you will have the goodness to touch the bell, Doctor. Oh gosh. Have I been frozen for ages? I hadn't noticed. I'm terribly sorry. Callum, can you hear me now? Okay. Both of us are having connection issues. That's fun. Oops. Did you hear the end of the story at least? This is the unfortunate part about live streaming reading anything, because the instant I have connection issues, it kind of becomes ridiculous. They don't call it a wild goose chase, no. Fortunately not. Got the bit about Christmas Spirit. Okay, that was pretty much the end. That's okay. Alright. You up for another one, or do you want what else is in the chat? I'm very sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, but hello. Alright, well, we'll do one more, and hopefully my internet will hold up still and won't completely abandon me. I feel quite bad because people keep dropping in and out of chat tonight, and like I don't really notice when they arrive because obviously I'm reading from a book. And at the start, I'm not sure it was any of people that I actually know. It was just quite odd and general. But all right, here we go. I do actually really like this next one as well, so it's a good one to end on for the night. Actually, I'm gonna have a little bit more to drink first because I'm mildly dying. Yeah, I think it's because I posted it on Twitter earlier, which was potentially a mistake, but hydration is key, very important. Alright, okay. This one's called The Speckled Band. On glancing over my notes of the 70 odd cases in which I have, during the last 8 years, studied the methods of my friend Sherlock Holmes, I find many tragic, some comic, a large number, but none commonplace. For working as he did, rather for the love of his art than for the acquirement of wealth, he refused to associate himself with any investigation which did not tend towards the unusual and even the fantastic. Of all these varied cases, however, I cannot recall any which presented more singular features than that which was associated with the well-known Surrey family of the Roylotts of Stoke Moran. The events in he tends to claim this about every case, by the way. It's just kind of a standard thing he does. The events in question occurred in the early days of my association with Holmes, when we were sharing rooms as bachelors in Baker Street. It is possible that I might have placed them upon record before, the time, from which I have only been freed during the last month by the untimely death of the lady to whom the pledge was given. It is perhaps as well that the facts should now come to light, for I have reason to know that there are widespread rumours as to the death of Mr. Grimsby Roylott, which tend to make the matter even more terrible than the truth. It was early in April of the year 83 that I woke one morning to find Sherlock Holmes standing, fully dressed, by the side of my bed. He was a late riser, as a rule, and as the clock on the mantelpiece showed me it was only 7:15, I blinked up at him in some surprise, and perhaps just a little resentment, for I was myself regular in my habits. "Very sorry to wake you up, Watson," I said. "Come along this morning. Mrs. Hudson has been woken up. She reported upon me, and I on you." "What is it then? A fire?" "No, a client. It seems that a young lady has arrived in a considerable state of excitement, who insists upon seeing me. She is waiting now in the sitting-room. Now, when young ladies wander about the metropolis at this hour of the morning, and wake sleepy people up out of their beds, I assume that it is something very pressing which they have to communicate. Should it prove to be an interesting case, you would, I am sure, wish to follow it from the outset. I thought at any rate that I should call you and give you the chance." "My dear fellow, I would not miss it for anything. I had no keener pleasure. I can use words. I had no keener pleasure than in following Holmes in his professional investigations, and in admiring the rapid deductions, as swift as intuitions, and yet always founded on a logical basis, from which he unravelled the problems which were submitted to him. I rapidly threw on my clothes, and was ready in a few minutes to accompany my friend down to the sitting-room. A lady dressed in black and heavily veiled, who had been sitting in the window, rose as we entered. "Good morning, madam," said Holmes cheerily. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my intimate friend and associate, Dr. Watson, before whom you can speak as freely as before myself. I am glad to see that Mrs. Hudson has had the good sense to light the fire. To it, and I shall order you a cup of hot coffee, for I observe that you are shivering." "It is not cold which makes me shiver," said the woman in a low voice, changing her seat as requested. "What then?" "It is fear, Mr. Holmes. It is terror." She raised her veil as she spoke, and we could see that she was indeed in a pitiable state of agitation, her face all drawn and grey, with restless, frightened eyes like those of some hunted animal. Her features and figure were those of a woman of 30, but her hair was shot with premature grey, and her expression was weary and haggard. Sherlock Holmes ran her over with one of his his quick, all-comprehensive glances. "You must not fear," he said, patting her forearm. "We shall soon set matters right, I have no doubt. You have come in by train this morning, I see. You know me, then?" No, but I observed the second half of a return ticket in the palm of your left glove. You must have started early, and yet you had a good drive in the dog cart along heavy roads before you reached the station. The lady gave a violent start and stared in bewilderment at my companion. There's no mystery, my dear madam, he said, smiling. The left arm of your jacket is splattered with mud in no less than 7 places. The marks are perfectly fresh, and there is no vehicle save a dog cart which throws up mud in that way, and then only when you sit on the left-hand side of the driver. Whatever your reasons may be, you are perfectly correct, said she. I started from home before 6, reached Leatherhead at 20 past, and came in by the first train to Waterloo. Sir, I can stand this strain no longer. I shall go mad if it continues. I've no one to turn to, none save only one who cares for me, and he, poor fellow, can be of little aid. I've heard of you, Mr. Holmes. I've heard of you from Mrs. Farintosh, whom you helped in the hour of her sore need. It was from her that I had your address. I, sir, do you not think that you could help me too, and at least throw a little light through the dense darkness which surrounds me? At present it is out of my power to reward you for your services, but in a month or 6 weeks, with the control of my own income, and then at least you shall not find me ungrateful. Holmes turned to his desk and, unlocking it, drew out a small case-book which he consulted. Farintosh, said he. Ah, yes, I recall the case. It was concerned with an opal tiara. I think it was before your time, Watson. I can only say, madam, that I shall be happy to devote some care to your case, as I did with that of your friend. As to reward, my profession is its own reward, but you are at liberty to defray whatever expenses I may be put to, at the time which suits you best. And now I beg that you will lay before us everything that may help us in forming an opinion upon the matter. Alas, replied our visitor, the very horror of my situation lies in the fake, and my suspicions depend so entirely upon small points which may seem trivial to another, and even he to whom all others I have a right to look for help and advice. Ugh. I'm gonna. I'm not sure if you could hear that sneeze. Um, all right, I'm gonna restart that sentence because I've entirely lost the track of where it was going. Okay. Alas, replied our visitor, the very horror of my situation lies in the fact that my fears are so vague, and my suspicions depend so entirely upon small points which might seem trivial to another, that even he to whom of all others I have a right to look for help and advice looks upon all that I can as the fancies of a nervous woman. He does not say so, but I can read it from his soothing answers and averted eyes. But I have heard, Mr. Holmes, that you can see deeply into the manifold wickedness of the human heart. You may advise me on how to walk amid the dangers which encompass me. I am all attention, madam. My name is Helen Stoner. I am living with my stepfather, who is the last survivor of one of the oldest Saxon families in England, the Roylotts of Stoke Moran, on the western border of Surrey. Holmes nodded his head. The name is familiar to me, said he. The family was at one time among the richest in England, and the estates extended over and Hampshire in the west. In the last century, however, 4 successive heirs were of a dissolute and wasteful disposition, and the family ruin was eventually completed by a gambler in the days of the Regency. Nothing was left save a few acres of ground, and the 200-year-old house, which is itself crushed under a heavy mortgage. The last squire dragged out his existence there, living the horrible life of an aristocratic pauper. But his only son, my stepfather, seeing that he must adapt himself to the new conditions, obtained an advance from a relative, which enabled him to take a medical degree, and went out to Calcutta, where, by his professional skill and the force of his character, he established a large practice. In a fit of anger, however, which had been perpetrated in the house, he beat his native butler to death, and narrowly escaped a capital sentence. As it was, he suffered a long term of imprisonment, and afterwards returned to England a morose and disappointed man. When Dr. Roylott was in India, he married my mother, Mrs. Stoner, the young widow of a Major General Stoner of the Bengal Artillery. My sister Julia and I were twins, and we were only 2 years old at the time of my mother's remarriage. She had a considerable sum of money, not less than £1,000 a year, and this she bequeathed to Dr. Roylott entirely while we resided, with a provision that a certain annual sum should be allowed to each of us in the event of our marriage. Shortly after our return to England, my mother died. She was killed 8 years ago in a railway accident near Crewe. Dr. Roylott then abandoned his attempts to establish himself in practice in London and took us to live with him in the old ancestral house at Stoke Moran. The money which my mother had left was enough for all our wants, and there seemed to be no obstacle to our happiness. But a terrible change came over our stepfather about this time. Instead of making friends and exchanging visits with our neighbours, who had at first been overjoyed to see a Roylott of Stoke Moran back in the old family seat, he shut himself out to indulge in ferocious quarrels with whoever might cross his path. Violence of temper approaching to mania has been hereditary in the men of the family, and in my stepfather's case it had, I believe, been intensified by his long residence in the tropics. A series of disgraceful brawls took place, two of which ended in the police court, until at last he became the terror of the village, and folks would fly at his approach. For he is a man of immense strength, and absolutely uncontrollable in his anger. Last week he held the local blacksmith over a parapet into a stream, and it was only by paying over all the money which I could gather together that I was able to avert another public exposure. He had no friends at all save the wandering gypsies, and he was upon the few acres of bramble-covered land which represent the family estate, and would accept in return the hospitality of their tents, wandering away with them sometimes for weeks on end. He has a passion also for Indian animals, which are sent over to him by a correspondent, and he has at this moment a cheetah and a baboon, which wander freely over his grounds and are feared by the villagers almost as much as their master. You can imagine from what I say that my poor sister Julia and I had no great pleasure in our lives. No servant would stay with us, and for a long time we did all the work in the house. She was but 30 at the time of her death, and yet her hair had already begun to whiten, even as mine has. She was dead then. She died just 2 years ago, and it is of her death that I wish to speak to you. You can understand that, living the life which I have described, we were little likely to see anyone of our own age and position. We had, however, an aunt, my mother's maiden sister, Miss Honoria Westphale, who lives near Harrow, and we were occasionally allowed to pay short visits to this lady's house. Julia went there at Christmas 2 years ago, and met there a half-pay major of Marines, to whom she became engaged. My father learned of the engagement, my father learned of the engagement when my sister returned, and offered no objection to the marriage. But within a fortnight of the day which had been fixed for the wedding, the terrible event occurred which has deprived me of my only companion. Sherlock Holmes had been leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed and his head sunk in a cushion, but he half opened his lids now, glanced across at his visitor. "Pray, be precise as to details," said he. "It is easy for me to be so, for every event of that dreadful time is seared into my memory. The manor house is, as I have already said, very old, and only one wing is now inhabited. The bedrooms in this wing, the sitting rooms being in the central block of the building. Of these bedrooms, the first is Dr. Roylott's, the second my sister's, and the third my own. There is no communication between them, but they all open out into the same corridor. Do I make myself plain?" "Perfectly so." "Well, the windows of the 3 rooms open out upon the lawn. That fatal night Dr. Roylott has gone to his room early, though we knew that he had not retired to rest, for my sister was troubled by the smell of the strong Indian cigars which it was his custom to smoke. She left her room, therefore, and came into mine, where she sat for some time, chatting about her approaching wedding. At 11 o'clock, she rose to leave me, but she paused at the door and looked back. "Tell me, have you ever heard anyone whistle in the dead of the night?" "Never," said I. "I suppose that you could not possibly whistle yourself in your sleep?" "Certainly not, but why?" "Because during the last few nights I've always, about 3 in the morning, heard a low, clear whistle. I'm a light sleeper, and it has awakened me. I cannot tell where it came from. Perhaps from the next room, perhaps from the lawn. I thought that I would just ask you whether you had heard it." "No, I've not. It must be those travellers in the plantation." "Very likely, and yet if it were on the lawn, I wonder that you did not hear it also." "I sleep more heavily than you." "Well, it is of no consequence at any rate." She smiled back at me, closed my door, and a few minutes later I heard her key turn in the lock. "Indeed," said Holmes. "Was it your custom to always lock yourselves in at night?" "Always." "And why?" I think that I mentioned to you that the doctor kept a cheetah and a baboon. We had no feeling of security unless our doors were locked. Quite so. Pray proceed with your statement. I could not sleep that night. A vague feeling of impending misfortune impressed me. My sister and I, you will recollect, were twin. How subtle are the links which bind two souls which are so closely allied. It was a wild night. The wind was howling outside, and the rain was beating and splashing against the windows. Suddenly, amidst all the hubbub of the gale, there burst forth a wild scream of a terrified woman. I knew that it was my sister's voice. I sprang from my bed, wrapped a shawl around me, and rushed into the corridor. As I opened my door, I seemed to hear a low whistle, such as my sister described, and a few minutes later a clanging sound as if a mass of metal had fallen. As I ran down the passage, my sister's door was unlocked, and revolved slowly upon its hinges. I stared at it, hardly knowing what was about to issue from it. By the light of the corridor lamp, I saw my sister appear at the opening, her face blanched with terror, her hands groping for help, her whole figure swaying to and fro like that of a drunkard. I ran to her and threw my arms around her, but at that moment her knees seemed to give way, and she fell to the ground. She writhed as one who is in terrible pain, and her limbs were dreadfully convulsed. At first I thought that she had not recognized me, but as I bent over she suddenly shrieked out in a voice which I shall never forget, "Oh my God, Helen! It was the band, the speckled band!" There was something else which she would fain have said, and she stamped the air in the direction of the doctor's room, but a fresh convulsion seized her and choked her words. I rushed out, calling loudly for my stepfather, and I met him hastening from his room in his dressing gown. When he reached my sister's side she was unconscious, and though he poured brandy down her throat and sent for medical aid from the village, all efforts were in vain, for she slowly sank and died without having recovered her consciousness. Such was the dreadful end of my beloved sister. "One moment," said Holmes. "Are you sure about this whistle and metallic sound? Could you swear to it?" That was what the county coroner asked me at the inquiry. It is my strong impression that I heard it, and yet, among the crash of the gale and the creaking of the old house, I may possibly have been deceived. Was your sister dressed? She was in her nightdress. In her right hand was found the charred stump of a match, and in her left a matchbox, showing that she had struck a light and looked about her when the alarm took place. That is important. And what conclusions did the coroner come to? He investigated the case with great care, for Dr. Roylott's conduct had long been notorious in the county, but he was unable to find any satisfactory cause of death. My evidence showed that the door had been fastened upon the inner side, and the windows were blocked by old-fashioned shutters, with broad iron bars, which were secured every night. The walls were carefully sounded and were shown to be quite solid all round. The flooring was also thoroughly examined, with the same result. The chimney is wide, but it is certain, therefore, that my sister was quite alone when she met her end. Besides, there were no marks of any violence upon her. How about poison? The doctors examined her for it, but without any success. What do you think that this unfortunate lady died of, then? It is my belief that she died of pure fear and nervous shock, though what it was that frightened her I cannot imagine. Were there travellers in the plantation at the time? Yes, there are nearly always some there. Ah, and what did you gather from this allusion to a band, a speckled band? Sometimes I have thought that it was merely the wild talk of delirium, referred to some band of people, perhaps to those very travellers in the plantation. I do not know whether the spotted handkerchiefs which so many of them wear over their heads might have suggested the strange adjectives which you used. Holmes shook his head like a man who is far from being satisfied. "These are very deep waters," said he. "Pray go on with your narrative." 2 years have passed since then, and my life has been, until lately, lonelier than ever. A month ago, however, a dear friend who I've known for many years has done me the honour to ask my hand in marriage. His name is Armitage, Percy Armitage, the second son of Mr. Armitage of Cranewater, near Reading. Opposition to the match, and we are to be married in the course of the spring. 2 days ago some repairs were started in the west wing of the building, and my bedroom wall has been pierced, so that I have had to move into the chamber in which my sister died, and to sleep in the very bed in which she slept. Imagine, then, my thrill of terror when, last night, as I lay awake, thinking over her terrible fate, I suddenly heard in the silence of the night the low whistle which had been the herald of her own death. I sprang up and lit the lamp, but nothing was to be seen in the room. I was too shaken to go to bed again, however, so I dressed, and as soon as it was daylight, I slipped down, got a dog cart at the Crown Inn, which is opposite, and drove to Leatherhead, from whence I have come on just asking your advice. You've done wisely, said my friend, but have you told me all? Yes, all. Miss Stoner, you have not. You are screening your stepfather. Why, what do you mean? For answer, Holmes pushed back the frill of black lace which fringed the hand that lay upon our visitor's knee. 5 little livid spots, the marks of 4 fingers and a thumb, were printed upon the white wrist. You have been cruelly used, said Holmes. The lady coloured deeply and covered her injured wrist. He is a hard man, she said, and perhaps he hardly knows his own strength. There was a long silence, during which Holmes leaned his chin upon his hands and stared into the... This is a very deep business, he said at last. There are 1,000 details which I should desire to know before I decide upon our course of action. Yet we may not have a moment to lose. If we were to come to Stoke Moran today, would it be possible for us to see over these rooms without the knowledge of your stepfather? As it happens, he spoke of coming into town today upon some of the most important business. It is probable that he will be away all day, and that there will be nothing to disturb you. We have a housekeeper now, but she is old and foolish, and I could easily get her out of the way. Excellent. You are not averse to this trip, Watson? By no means. Then we shall both come. And what are you going to do yourself? I have 1 or 2 things which I would wish, but I shall return by the 12 o'clock train so as to be there in time for your coming. And you may expect us early in the afternoon. I have myself some small business matters to attend to. Will you not wait and breakfast? No, I must go. My heart is lightened already since I have confided my trouble to you. I shall look forward to seeing you again this afternoon. She dropped her thick black veil over her face and glided from the room. What do you think of it all, Watson? Asked Sherlock Holmes, leaning back in his chair. It seems to me to be a most dark and sinister business. Dark enough and sinister enough. Yet, if the lady is correct in saying that the flooring and walls are sound, and that the door, window, and chimney are impassable, then her sister must have been undoubtedly alone when she met her mysterious end. What becomes then of these nocturnal whistles, and what of the very peculiar words of the dying woman? I cannot think. When you combine the idea of whistles at night, the presence of a band of travellers who are in intimate terms with this old doctor, the fact that we have every reason to believe that the doctor has an interest in preventing his stepdaughter's marriage, the dying allusion to a band, and finally the fact that Miss Helen Stoner heard a metallic clang, which might have been caused by one of those metal bars that secured the shutters falling back into its place, I'm to think that the mystery may be cleared along those lines. But what then did the travellers do? I cannot imagine. I see that many objections to any such theory, and so do I. It is precisely for that reason that we are going to Stoke Moran this day. I want to see whether the objections are fatal, or if they may be explained away. But what in the name of the devil? The exclamation had been drawn from my companion by the fact that our door had been suddenly dashed open, and that a huge man had framed himself in the aperture. His costume was a peculiar mix of the professional and of the agricultural, having a black top hat, a long frock coat, and a pair of high gaiters with a hunting crop swinging in his hand. So tall was he that his hat actually brushed the crossbar of the doorway, and spanned across from side to side. A large face, seared with 1,000 wrinkles, burned yellow with the sun, and marked with every evil passion, was turned from one to the other of us, while his deep-set, bile-shot eyes, and his high, thin, fleshless nose gave him somewhat the resemblance to a fierce old bird of prey. Which of you is Mr. Holmes? Asked this apparition. My name, sir, but you have the advantage of me, said my companion quietly. I am Dr. Grimsby Roylott, of Stoke Moran. Indeed, doctor, said Holmes blandly. Pray take a seat. I will do nothing of the kind. My stepdaughter has been here. I have traced her. What has she been saying to you? Said Holmes. What has she been saying to you? Screamed the old man furiously. But I have heard that the crocuses promise well, continued my companion imperturbably. Ha! You put me off, do you? Said our new visitor, taking a step forward and shaking his hunting crop. I know you, you scoundrel. I've heard of you before. You are Holmes, the meddler. My friend smiled. Holmes, the busybody. His smile broadened. Holmes, the Scotland Yard Jack in office. Holmes chuckled heartily. Your conversation is most entertaining, said he. When you go out, close the door, for there's a decided draught. I will go when I've had my say. Don't you dare to meddle. I know that Miss Owner has been here. I traced her. I am a dangerous man to fall foul of. See here. He stepped forward, seized the poker, and bent it into a curve with his huge brown hands. See that you keep yourself out of my grip, he snarled, and hurled the twisted poker into the fireplace. He strode out of the room. Well, he seems a very amiable person, said Holmes, laughing. I'm not quite so bulky, but if he had remained I might have shown him that my grip was not much more feeble than his own. As he spoke, he picked up the steel poker, and with a sudden effort straightened it out again. Fancy his having the insolence to confound me with the official detective force. This investigation, however, and I only trust that our little friend will not suffer from her imprudence in allowing this brute to trace her. And now, Watson, we shall order breakfast, and afterwards I shall walk down to Doctor's Commons, where I hope to get some data which may help us in this matter. It was nearly 1 o'clock when Sherlock Holmes returned from his excursion. He held in his hand a sheet of blue paper, scrawled over with notes and figures. I have seen the will of the deceased wife, said he. To determine its exact meaning, I have been obliged to work out the present prices of the investments with which it is concerned. The total income, which at the time of the wife's death was a little short of £1,100, is now, through the fall in agricultural prices, not. Each daughter can claim an income of £250 in case of marriage, and it is evident, therefore, that if both girls had married, this beauty would have been a mere pittance, while even one of them would cripple him to a very serious extent. My morning's work has not been wasted, since it has proved that he has the very strongest motives for standing in the way of anything of the sort. And now, Watson, this is too serious for dawdling, especially as the old man is aware that we are interesting ourselves in his affairs. So if you are ready, we shall call a cab and drive to Waterloo. I shall be very much obliged if you would slip your revolver into your pocket. Annelius No. 2 is an excellent argument with the gentleman who can twist steel pokers into knots. That and a toothbrush are, I think, all we need. At Waterloo, we were fortunate in catching a train for Leatherhead at the station inn, and for 4 or 5 miles through the lovely Surrey lanes. It was a perfect day, with a bright sun and a few fleecy clouds in the heavens. The trees and wayside hedges were just throwing out their first green shoots, and the air was full of pleasant smell of moist earth. To me, at least, there was a strange contrast between the sweet promise of the spring and this singular quest upon which we were engaged. My companion sat in the front of the trap, his arms folded, his hat pulled down over his eyes, and his chin sunk upon his breast, buried in the deepest thought. Suddenly, however, he started, tapped me on the shoulder, and pointed over the meadows. Look there, said he. A heavily timbered park stretched up in a gentle slope, thickening into a grove at the highest point. From amid the branches there jutted out the grey gables and high roof-tree of the very old mansion. Yes, sir, that be the house of Dr. Grimsby Roylott, remarked the driver. There is some building going on here, said Holmes. That is where we are going. There's the village, said the driver, pointing to the cluster of roofs in some distance to the left. But if you want to get to the house, you'll find it shorter to get over this stile, and so by the footpath over the fields. There it is, where the lady's walking. And the lady, I fancy, is Miss Stoner, observed Holmes, shading his eyes. Yes, I think we'd better do as you suggest. We got off, paid our fare, and the trap rattled back on its way to Leatherhead. I thought it as well, said Holmes as we climbed the stile, that this fellow should think we had come here as architects, or on some definite business. It may stop his gossip. Good afternoon. You see that we have been as good as our word. Our client of the morning had hurried forward to meet us, with a face which spoke her joy. I have been waiting so eagerly for you, she cried, shaking hands with us warmly. All has gone out splendidly. Dr. Roylott has gone to town, and it is unlikely that he will be back before evening. We have had the pleasure of making the doctor's acquaintance, said Holmes, and in a few words he sketched out what had occurred. Miss Stoner turned white to the lips as she listened. Good heavens, she cried. He has followed me, then. So it appears. He's so cunning that I never know when I'm safe from him. What will he say when he returns? Well, he must guard himself, for he may find that there is something that we shall take away around at Harrow. Now, we must make the best use of our time, so kindly take us at once to the rooms which we are to examine. The building was of grey lichen-blotched stone, with a high central portion and two curving wings, like the claws of a crab, thrown out on each side. In one of these wings, the windows were broken and blocked with wooden boards, while the roof was partly caved in, a picture of ruin. The central portion was in a little better repair, but the right block was comparatively modern even, and the blinds in the windows with the blue smoke curling up from the chimneys showed that this was where the family resided. Some scaffolding had been erected against the end wall, and the stonework had been broken into, but there were no signs of any workmen at the moment of our visit. Holmes walked slowly up and down the ill-trimmed lawn, and examined with deep attention the outsides of the windows. This, I take it, belongs to the room in which you used to sleep, the centre one to your sisters, and the one next to the building of Dr. Roylott. The one next to the main building to Dr. Roylott's chamber? Exactly so, but I am now sleeping in the middle one, pending the alterations, as I understand. By the way, there does not seem to be any very pressing need for repairs at that end wall. There were none. I believe it was an excuse to move me from my room. Ah, that is suggestive. Now, on the other side of this narrow wing runs the corridor from which these three rooms open. There are windows in it, of course, too narrow for anyone to pass through. As you both locked your doors at night, your rooms were unapproachable from that side. Now, would you have the kindness to go into your room and bar your shutters? Miss Stoner did so, and Holmes, after careful examination through the open window, endeavoured in every way to force the shutter open, but without success. There was no slit through which a knife could be passed to raise the bar. Then with his lens he tested the hinges, but they were of solid iron, built firmly into the massive masonry. Hmm, said he, scratching his chin in some perplexity. My theory certainly presents some difficulties. No one could pass these shutters if they were bolted. Well, we shall see if the inside throws any light upon the matter. Led into the whitewashed corridor from which the three bedrooms opened. Holmes refused to examine the third chamber, so we passed at once to the second, that in which Miss Stoner was now sleeping, and in which her sister had met with her fate. It was a homely little room, with a low ceiling and a gaping fireplace, after the fashion of old country houses. A brown chest of drawers stood in one corner, a narrow white counterpaned bed in another, and a dressing table on the left-hand side of the window. These articles, with two small wickerwork chairs, made up all the furniture in the room save for a square of Wilton carpet in the centre. The boards round and the panelling of the walls were of brown worm-eaten oak, so old and discoloured that it may have been dated to the original building of the house. Holmes drew one of the chairs into the corner and sat silent, while his eyes travelled round and up and down, taking in every detail of the apartment. Where does that bell communicate with? He asked, at last pointing to a thick bell rope which hung down beside the bed, the tassel actually lying upon the pillow. It goes to the housekeeper's room. It looks newer than the other things. Yes, it was only put in there a couple of years ago. Your sister asked for it, I suppose? No, I never heard of her using it. We used always to get what we wanted for ourselves. Indeed, it seemed unnecessary to put so nice a bell pull there. You will excuse me for a few minutes while I satisfy myself as to the floor. He threw himself down upon his face with his lens, and crawled swiftly back and forwards, examining minutely the cracks between the boards. Then he did the same with the woodwork with which the chamber was panelled, and finally he walked over to the bed, and spent some time in staring at it and running his eye up and down the wall. Finally, he took the bell rope in his hand and gave it a brisk tug. Why, it's a dummy, he said. Won't it ring? No, it's not even attached to a wire. This is very interesting. You can see now that it's fastened to a hook, just above where the little opening for the ventilator is. How very absurd! I never noticed that before. Very strange, muttered Holmes, pulling at that rope. There are one or two very singular points about this room. For example, what a fool the builder must be to open a ventilator into another room when, with the same trouble, he might have communicated with the air outside air. That is also quite modern, said the lady. Done about the same time as the bell rope. Yes, there were several little changes carried about at that time. They seem to have been of a most interesting character. Dummy bell ropes and ventilators which do not ventilate. With your permission, Miss Stoner, we shall now carry our researches into the inner apartment. Dr. Grimsby Roylott's chamber was larger than that of his stepdaughter, but was as plainly furnished. A camp bed, a small wooden shelf of books, mostly of a technical character, an armchair beside the bed, a plain wooden chair against the wall, a round table, a large iron safe, and a large iron safe were the principal things which met the eye. Holmes walked slowly round and examined each and all of them with the keenest interest. "What's in here?" he asked, tapping the safe. "My stepfather's business papers." "Oh, you've seen inside, then?" "Only once, some years ago. I remember that it was full of papers. There isn't a cat in it, for example." "No, what a strange idea. Well, look at this." He took up a small saucer of milk which stood on top of it. "No, we don't keep a cat, but there is a cheetah and a baboon." "Ah, yes, of course. Well, a cheetah is just a big cat. And yet a saucer of milk does not go very far in satisfying its wants, I dare say. There is one point which I should wish to determine." He squatted down in front of the wooden chair and examined the seat of it with the greatest attention. "Thank you. That is quite settled," said he, rising and putting his lens in his pocket. "Hello, here's something interesting." The object which had caught his eye was a small dog leash hung in one corner of the bed. The leash, however, was curled up on itself, and tied so as to make a loop of whipcord. "What do you make of that, Watson?" "Oh, it's a common enough leash, but I don't know why it should be tied." That is not quite so common, is it?" "Ah, me. It's a wicked world, and when a clever man turns his brains to crime, it is the worst of all. I think that I've seen enough now, Miss Stoner, and with your permission we shall walk out upon the lawn." I had never seen my friend's face so grim, or his brow so dark as it was when we turned from the scene of this investigation. We had walked several times up and down the lawn, neither Miss Stoner nor myself liking to break in upon his thoughts, before he roused himself from his reverie. "It is very essential, Miss Stoner," said he, "that you should absolutely follow my advice in every respect." "I shall most certainly do so." "The matter is too serious for any hesitation. Your life may depend upon your compliance. I assure you that I am in your hands. In the first place, both my friend and I must spend the night in your room." Both Miss Stoner and I gazed at him in astonishment. "Yes, it must be so. Let me explain. I believe that this is the village inn over here." "Yes, that is the Crown." "Very good. Your windows will be visible from there." "Certainly." "You must confine yourself to your room, on pretence of a headache, when your stepfather comes back. When you hear him retire for the night, you must open the shutters of your window, undo the clasp, put your lamp there as a signal to us, and then withdraw quietly, with everything which you are likely to want, into the room which you used to occupy. I have no doubt that in spite of the repairs you should manage there for one night." "Oh yes, easily." "The rest you will leave in our hands." "But what will you do?" "We shall spend the night in your room, and we shall investigate the cause of this noise which has disturbed you." "I believe, Mr. Holmes, that you have already made up your mind," said Miss Stoner, laying her hand upon my companion's sleeve. "Perhaps I have." "Then, for pity's sake, tell me what was the cause of my sister's death." "I should prefer to have clearer proofs before I speak." "You can at least tell me whether my own thought is correct, and if she died from some sudden fright." "No, I do not think so. I think that there was probably some more tangible cause. And now, Miss Stoner, we must leave you, for if Dr. Roylott returned and saw us, our journey would be in vain. Goodbye, and be brave. For if you will do what I have told you, you may rest assured that we shall soon drive away the dangers that threaten you." Sherlock Holmes and I had no difficulty in engaging a bedroom and sitting room at the Crown Inn. They were on the upper floor, and from our window we could command a view of the avenue gate, and of the inhabited wing of Stoke Moran Manor House. At dusk we saw Dr. Grimsby Roylott drive past, his huge form looming up beside the little figure of the lad who drove him. The boy had some slight difficulty in undoing the heavy iron gates, and we heard the hoarse roar of the hoarse roar of the doctor's voice, and saw the fury with which he shook his clenched fists at him. The trap drove on, and a few minutes later we saw a sudden light spring up among the trees, as the lamp was lit in one of the sitting rooms. "You know, Watson," said Holmes, as we sat together in the gathering darkness, "I have really some scruples as to taking you tonight. There is a distinct element of danger." "Can I be of assistance?" "Well, your presence might be invaluable." "Then I shall certainly come." "It's very kind of you. You speak of danger. You've evidently seen more in these rooms than was visible to me." "No, but I fancy I may have deduced a little more. I imagine that you saw all that I did." "I saw nothing remarkable save the bell rope, and what purpose that could answer, I confess, is more than I can imagine." "You saw the ventilator, too?" "Yes, but I do not think that is such a very unusual thing to have. It was so small that a rat could hardly pass through." "I knew that we should find a ventilator before ever we came to Stoke Moran." "My dear Holmes!" "Oh, yes, I did. You remember in her statement that she said that her sister could smell Dr. Roylott's cigar. Now, of course, that suggested at once that there must be a communication between the two rooms. It could only be a small one, or it would have been remarked upon at the coroner's inquiry. I deduced a ventilator." "But what harm can there be in that?" "Well, there is at least a curious coincidence of dates. A ventilator is made, a cord is hung, and a lady who sleeps in the bed dies. Does that not strike you?" "I cannot as yet see any connection." "Did you observe anything very peculiar about the bed?" "No." "It was clamped to the floor. Did you ever see a bed fastened like that before?" "Cannot say that I have." "The lady couldn't move her bed. It must always be in the same relative position to the ventilator and to the rope, or so we may call it, since it was clearly never meant for a bell pull." "Holmes," I cried, "I seem to see dimly what you are hinting at. We are only just in time to prevent some subtle and horrible crime." "Subtle enough and horrible enough. When a doctor goes wrong, he is the first of criminals. He has nerve and he has knowledge. Palmer and Pritchard were among the heads of their profession. This man strikes even deeper. But I think, Watson, that we shall be able to strike deeper still. But we shall have horrors enough before the night is over. For goodness' sake, let us have a quiet pipe and turn our minds for a few hours to something more cheerful." At about 9 o'clock, the light among the trees was extinguished, and all was dark in the direction of the manor house. 2 hours passed slowly away, and then suddenly, just at the stroke of 11, sorry, just at the stroke of 11, oh crap, where was I? Oh yes, okay. Suddenly, just at the stroke of 11, a single bright light shone out right in front of us. "That is our signal," said Holmes, springing to his feet. "It comes from the middle window." As we passed out, he exchanged a few words with the landlord, explaining that we were going on a late visit to an acquaintance, and that it was possible that we might spend the night there. A moment later we were out in the dark road, a chill wind blowing in our faces, and one yellow light twinkling in front of us through the gloom to guide us to our sombre errand. There was little difficulty in entering the grounds, for unrepaired breaches gaped in the old park wall. Making our way towards the trees, we reached the lawn, crossed it, and were about to enter through the window, when out of a clump of laurel bushes there darted what seemed to be a hideous and distorted child, who threw itself upon the grass with writhing limbs, and then ran swiftly across the lawn into the darkness. "My God!" I whispered. "Did you see it?" Holmes was for the moment as startled as I. His hand closed like a vice upon my wrist in his agitation. Then he broke into a low laugh and put his lips to my ear. "It's a nice household," he murmured. "That is the baboon." I had forgotten the strange pets which the doctor affected. There was a cheetah, too. Perhaps we might find it upon our shoulders at any moment. Confess that I felt easier in my mind when, after following Holmes's example and slipping off my shoes, I found myself inside the bedroom. My companion noiselessly closed the shutters and moved the lamp onto the table, cast his eyes around the room. All was as we had seen it in the daytime. Then, creeping up to me and making a trumpet of his hand, he whispered into my ear again so gently that it was all I could do to distinguish the words. "The least sound would be fatal to our plans." I nodded to show that I had heard. "We must sit without light. You would see it through the ventilator." I nodded again. "Do not go to sleep. Your very life may depend on it. Have your pistol ready in case we should need it. I will sit on the end of the bed, and you in that chair." I took out my revolver and laid it in the corner of the table. Holmes had brought up a long, thin cane, and this he placed upon the bed beside him. By it he laid a box of matches and the stump of a candle. Then he turned down the lamp, and we were left in darkness. How shall I ever forget that dreadful vigil? I could not hear a sound, not even the drawing of breath, and yet I knew that my companion sat open-eyed within a few feet of me, in the same state of nervous tension in which I was myself. The shutters cut off the least ray of light, and we waited in absolute darkness. From outside came the occasional cry of a night bird, and once at our very window a long-drawn, cat-like whine, which told us that the cheetah was indeed at liberty. Far away we could hear the deep tones of the parish clock, which boomed out every quarter of an hour. How long they seemed, those quarters! 12 struck, and 1, and 2, and 3, and still we sat waiting silently for whatever might befall. Suddenly, there was a momentary gleam of light up in the direction of the ventilator, which vanished immediately, but was succeeded by a strong smell of burning oil and heated metal. Someone in the next room had lit a dark lantern. I heard a gentle sound of movement, and then all was silent once more, though the smell grew stronger. For half an hour I sat with straining ears. Then suddenly another sound became audible. A very gentle, soothing sound, like that of a small jet of steam escaping continually from a kettle. The instant that we heard it, Holmes sprung from the bed, struck a match, and lashed furiously with his cane at the bell-pull. "You see it, Watson," he yelled. "You see it!" But I saw nothing. At the moment when Holmes struck the light, I heard a low, clear whistle, but the sudden flashing glare into my weary eyes made it impossible for me to tell what it was that my friend lashed at so savagely. I could, however, see that his face was deadly pale and filled with horror and loathing. He had ceased to strike and gazed up at the ventilator, when suddenly there broke into the silence of the night the most horrible cry to which I have ever listened one to which I have ever listened. It swelled up louder and louder, a hoarse yell of pain and anger and fear, all mingled into one dreadful shriek. They say that away down in the village, and even in the distant parsonage, that cry raised the sleepers from their beds. It stuck cold to our hearts, and I stood gazing at Holmes and he at me, until the last echoes of it had died away into the silence from which it rose. "What can it mean?" I gasped. "It means that this is all over," Holmes answered, "and perhaps, after all, it is for the best. Take your pistol. We will enter Dr. Roylott's room." With a grave face he lit the lamp, and led the way down the corridor. Twice he struck at the chamber door, without any reply from me, then turned the handle and entered, I at his heels, with the cocked pistol in my hand. It was a singular sight which met our eyes. On the table stood a dark lantern with the shutter half open, throwing a brilliant beam of light upon the iron safe, the door of which was ajar. Excuse me. Beside this table, on the wooden chair, sat Dr. Grimsby Roylott, clad in a long grey dressing-gown, his bare ankles protruding beneath, and his feet thrust into red, heelless Turkish slippers. Across his lap lay the short stock with the long leash, which we had noticed during the day. Gosh, where was I? Oh yes, okay. His chin was cocked upwards, and his eyes were fixed in a dreadful, rigid stare at the corner of the ceiling. Round his brow he had a peculiar yellow band, with brownish speckles, which seemed to be bound tightly round his head. As we entered, he made neither sound nor motion. The speckled band," whispered Holmes. He took a step forwards, and in an instant his strange headgear began to move, and then reared itself from among his hair, the squat diamond-shaped head and puffed neck of a loathsome serpent. "It's," cried Holmes, "the deadliest snake in India. He's died within 10 seconds of being bitten. Violence does, in truth, recoil upon the violent, and the schemer falls into the pit which he digs for another. Let us thrust this creature back into its den, and we can then remove Miss Stoner to some place of shelter, and let the county police know what has happened." As he spoke, he threw the dog whip swiftly from the man's lap, and throwing the noose around the reptile's neck, he drew it from its horrid perch, and, carrying it at arm's length, threw it into the iron safe, which he closed upon it. Such are the true facts of the death of Dr. Grimsby Roylott of Stoke Moran. It is not a narrative that has already run too great a length by telling how we broke the sad news to the terrified girl, how we conveyed her by the morning train to the care of her good aunt at Harrow, or how the slow process of official inquiry came to the conclusion that the doctor met his fate while indiscreetly playing with a dangerous pet. The little which I had yet to learn of the case was told to me by Sherlock Holmes as we travelled back the next day. I had, he said, come to an entirely erroneous conclusion, which shows, my dear Watson, how dangerous it always is to reason from insufficient data. The presence of the travellers, the use of the word band, no doubt to explain the appearance which she had caught a hurried glimpse of by the light of her match, was sufficient to put me on an entirely wrong scent. I can only claim the merit that I instantly reconsidered my position when, however, it became clear to me that whatever danger threatened the occupant of the room could not come either from the window or the door. My attention was speedily drawn, as I remarked to you, to this ventilator, and to the belt rope which hung down the bed. The discovery that this was a dummy, and that the bed was clamped to the floor, instantly gave rise to the suspicion that the rope was there as a bridge for something passing through the hole. And coming to the bed, the idea of a snake instantly occurred to me, and when I coupled it with my knowledge that the doctor was furnished with a supply of creatures from India, I felt that I was probably on the right track. The idea of using a form of poison which could not possibly be discovered by any chemical test was just such a one as would occur to a clever and ruthless man who had an Eastern training. The rapidity with which such a poison could take effect would also, from his point of view, be an advantage. It would be a sharp-eyed coroner indeed who could distinguish the two little dark punctures which would show where the poison fangs had done their work. Then I thought of the whistle. Of course, he must recall the snake before the morning light revealed it to the victim. He had trained it, probably by the use of the milk which we saw, to return to him when summoned. He would put it through the ventilator at the hour that he thought best, with the certainty on the bed. It might or might not bite the occupant. Perhaps she might escape every night for a week, but sooner or later she must fall victim. I had come to these conclusions before I ever entered this room. An inspection of his chair showed me that he had been in the habit of standing on it, which of course would be necessary in order that he could reach the ventilator. The light of the safe, the saucer of milk, and the loop of whipcord were enough to finally dispel any doubts which may have remained. The metallic clang heard by Miss Stoner was obviously caused by her stepfather hastily closing the door to his safe upon its terrible occupant. Having once made up my mind, you know the steps which I took in order to put the matter to proof. I heard the creature hiss, as I have no doubt that you did also. He lit the light and attacked it, with the result of driving it through the ventilator, and also with the result of causing it to turn upon its master at the other side. Some of the blows of my cane came home and roused its snakish temper, so that it flew upon the first person it saw. In this way I am no doubt indirectly responsible for Dr. Grimsby Roylott's death, and I cannot say that it is likely to weigh very heavily upon my conscience. The end. Love windpipe. Yeah, that's probably one of my favourite ones. Just because he gets what he deserves, frankly. I mean, like, if you're gonna train your pet snake to murder your stepdaughters so you can steal their income and, like, inheritance, you may as well be good at it, you know? But yeah, I think I'm gonna call it a night there, though, because it's 11:15. And that is a long time to have been reading for. But yeah, I've had a good time. You keep trying, and all right. Well, thank you for coming. Yeah. It's been lovely to see you in the chat, my guy. It was also lovely to see the other people who turned up for bits I don't know how long any of them actually stayed, to be honest, because they seem to have kept like dropping in the middle of stories and then leaving by the time I noticed that they were in the chat. So that was um, less than great on my part. I should figure out a way of paying more attention to chat as it's happening. But yeah, hopefully anyone who's watching this back has enjoyed it too, and there hasn't been too many gaps where the internet cut out. I'll probably look into power lining my laptop so that that stops happening. But yeah, there are all the technical stuff as it goes on. In the meantime, oh gosh, I think I said I was going to read Oscar Wilde on Friday, but if you or anyone else has any suggestions or requests, let me know, obviously. And yeah, I'll hopefully see you on Friday, and if not, I'll see you next time. Thanks for coming. Have a good night.